because it helps to share.
También quería informarles,
I would also
de
like
pronto ya
to
escucharon el
inform
anuncio
you,
ahí,
perhaps you've
que el
heard
webinar de hoy está siendo
that today's
grabado y
webinar
el
is being
video será
recorded
publicado
and
en
the
la
video
página
will
web
be
de
made
ACARRD
available
por
on
sus
the
cuentas
actor's
de
webpage
medios de comunicación. Entonces,
and
si
its
no se sienten
media.
cómodos
So if you don't
apareciendo en el
feel
video, les
comfortable
pido por favor
appearing on the
mantener sus
video,
cámaras
please
apagadas y
keep your
utilizar el chat
cameras
en vez del
off and
micrófono
use the
si quieren
chat
hacer
instead
preguntas.
of
Eso
the
si no se
microphone if you'd
sienten
like
bien
to ask
apareciendo
questions. That is, if you're not
en la
comfortable
grabación.
with appearing in the
Mm,
video.
De todas formas, les pido a
In
todos,
any
ya que
case,
nos
I would like to
panelistas,
request
cuando
everyone
están
except
hablando,
for the
mantener apagados
panelists,
sus
please
micrófonos
keep your
si no los están
microphones
usando en ese
off if
momento
you're
para hacer
not
una pregunta.
speaking or you're not asking a question
Y
at the
bueno,
time.
eh, me- para mí es un gusto
It
moderar
is
este
a
diálogo.
pleasure for
Mi
me to
nombre es Frances
moderate this
Thompson,
discussion.
yo
My name is
trabajo como
Frances
investigadora
Thompson. I work
independiente
as
y
an
soy parte de
independent
ACTER
researcher and I'm part of
2021.
Actors since 2021.
ACTER es la Asociación para
Actor
Mejorar la Gobernanza de la
is an
Tierra, el Agua y los
organization to
Recursos Naturales,
improve natural
y sus miembros
resources,
incluyen
water, and
investigadores
land. Its members
académicos,
include
expertos independientes
academics,
y también
specialists,
líderes de
researchers, and
organizaciones
also
campesinas y funcionarios
organization
públicos.
leaders
Sus
and
asociados
public
vienen de 35 países distintos, así
and
que
public
ACTER coordina
servants.
una
We
red
have
mundial que
different
trabaja por
countries.
una
It's an
gobernanza
international
democrática
network
de la
that
tierra y
works
los
for
recursos
democratic
naturales.
governance of the land and its
Contribuye
natural
a renovar
resources.
y
It
ampliar la
contributes to
reflexión y
renew
la acción
and
en este
broaden
ámbito
reflection and
mediante
action
el intercambio
in
de
this sphere
opiniones
through
y
the
socios.
exchange of its
Como dije,
members and
pues de
partners,
diversos
as I
ámbitos
said,
de
from
comunidades
various
campesinas, forestales,
areas,
agrícolas,
whether it's
agroinvestigación,
rural or
ONGs,
research
instituciones
areas or
públicas.
NGOs or public
Y pues siempre en
institutions.
relación con los movimientos
And
ciudadanos
also
comprometidos contra el
always
acaparamiento de tierras y a
working
favor del
against land
fortalecimiento de la
grabbing and
agricultura
for the
campesina.
strengthening of
Y
peasant
bueno, no sé si
agriculture.
Matthew
I'm not sure if
quiere de pronto
Matthew would
presenta a
like
Matthew, que
to.
es el coordinador de
Oh,
ACTER,
I'd like
que
to introduce him.
está
First of
ahí.
all,
No
he
sé si de
coordinates
pronto
Actor.
Matthew
He's
quiere
here.
poner
Perhaps he
el
would
link de
like
ACTER
to
en el chat,
place
por si
Actor's
la
link
gente
on
quiere
the
acceder.
chat in case you would
Yo la
like to
verdad he
access
tenido
it.
problemas con la
I've
página de
had
estos
some
días, pero
problems with
esperemos que está
the web
funcionando.
page in the last couple of days, but
Em,
let's hope it's working.
bueno, qué pena por
Okay.
estoy hablando mucho.
I'm
Les cuento
speaking
que
too much.
hace
I
un mes o un año
apologize.
otras
About a
personas
year
en ACTER
ago,
empezaron a
other people
preguntarme
at Actor
sobre
started
lo que ha
asking
estado pasando en
about
Colombia
what's been
y pues
happening in Colombia
sobre cómo
and
avanza la reforma agraria en el
how
país.
the agrarian
Y pues ya en
reform
ese
is moving
contexto,
forward there. So,
pues
in that
empezamos a hablar
context,
y
we started
a pensar en
talking
organizar
and
estos
thinking about
diálogos.
organizing
Y
this
ya con la
discussion.
segunda conferencia
With the
internacional
second
sobre reforma
international
agraria y
conference on
desarrollo
agrarian
acercando,
reform
pues
and
nos pareció un muy buen
development
momento
coming
para concretar la
near,
idea
we
de
thought
este
it'd be a
webinar
good
para
time for
compartir
us
sobre
to
las
have these
experiencias
webinars to
recientes de
share
Colombia
about
en
recent
cuanto a sus
experiences in
procesos de transición
Colombia with
agraria.
regards to the
Entonces, pues
agrarian
estamos muy
reform.
agradecidos
We are
con
very thankful with
Y
Nuri
Jennifer por su
and
disposición de
Jennifer for
compartir y
their
regalarnos su
availability to
tiempo.
share and
Las voy a
for giving
presentar.
us of their time. I'd like to introduce
Elsa
them.
Nuri Martínez
Elsa
es
Nuri
presidenta de
Martinez
la
is
Federación
president of the
Nacional
National
Sindical Unitaria
Federation of
Agropecuaria de
Agricultural
Colombia,
Trade
FENSUAGRO,
Unions,
y también
FENSUAGRO,
secretaria
and
de la
she is
región de
also
las Américas de la
secretary of
Vía
the Americas
Campesina.
region of La Via
Nuri
Campesina.
Yatsu Martínez
Nuri
Novoa
Jatsu
es
Martinez
abogada
Novoa is an
coordinadora del
attorney
área
and
de tierras y
coordinator of the
derechos
Land and
territoriales
Territorial Rights
de la
area
Comisión Colombiana de
at the
Juristas,
Colombian
también
Commission of
conocida como
Jurists,
CCJ,
also
por si
known
me
as the
escuchan decir CCJ.
CCJ, in
Y
case you hear me
para
refer
aclarar,
to
pues
it as
tenemos,
CCJ.
como dicen los colombianos,
And
dos
as Colombians
tocayas,
say, we
Nuri
have
las dos se llaman Nuri Martínez.
two
Entonces, muchas
namesakes, two
veces voy a
people with the
decir
same name.
Nuri
So
del
I would be
Fesuagro y
saying
Nuri de
Nuri
CCJ para evitar
from Fesuagro or
confusiones.
Nuri from
Y
CCJ to
bueno, y
avoid
tenemos a
confusion.
Jennifer
And
Vargas
we also
Reina, que es
have Jennifer
investigadora y
Vargas
profesora
Reina,
de
who
la
is a
Universidad
researcher and
Nacional de
professor in
Colombia
the Department
y
of
también
Social Work at the National University
cofundadora
of
del Centro
Colombia and
Nacional de
co-founder
Acción
of the
para la Paz y
Center
los
for
Derechos
Research and
Humanos,
Action for
CIPAD.
Peace and Human Rights,
Bueno,
CIPAD.
como se darán cuenta, tenemos un panel
As you've seen,
excelente
we have an
y estoy muy
amazing
motivada por
panel, and I
escucharles.
am really
Vamos a
excited to
tener, ¿cómo
hear
vamos
them.
a hacer esto? Vamos a
How will
tener
this
3
work?
rondas de
We will
preguntas
have three
sobre el
rounds for
pasado, el
questions
presente y el
on the
futuro de la
past,
reforma
present,
agraria
and
en
future
Colombia.
of
Son
agrarian
preguntas
reform in
bastante
Colombia.
amplias, pero
These are
esto
very
crea como
broad
una flexibilidad
questions, but
para los panelistas
it
hablar
allows for
como
flexibility
de
for
temas que
panelists
más
to
importante les
discuss
parece.
what
Cada
they
panelista tendrá 5
think is
minutos
more
para
important. Each
responder a cada
panelist will have
pregunta
5 minutes to answer
y eso
each
da
question,
cerca de
and that
15
will give
minutos
them
para cada
roughly
ronda
15
de
minutes
3
for
preguntas.
each round that
Me
consists of
disculpan
three
de
questions.
antemano
I apologize in
Nuri tiene
advance. Nuri, and
si puede
Jenny, if
intentar
I
cómo
interrupt you,
asegurar
I
que
will try
alcancemos
to
las tres
make
preguntas sin
sure
que las tres
that
panelistas
we
puedan hablar.
include
Entonces,
all
de
three
pronto
questions and that everyone
interrumpo,
gets
voy
to
a poner
speak. So if I interrupt you,
así
I will
primero
do
y
so
luego las
like
entonces
so.
me perdonan, por
But
favor.
if I have to speak, I apologize in
Ya, y
advance.
después de las tres rondas, en la
And
segunda
after the
hora del
three
evento vamos a
rounds, on the
abrir el
second
diálogo
hour
a
of
los
the
demás
event, we will open
participantes
up to the other
y ahí tendrán
participants,
la
and then
oportunidad
you'll
todos
have the
y todas de
opportunity,
hacer
all of
preguntas a
you,
los
to
panelistas
ask
o
questions
observaciones
to the
sobre lo
panelists
dicho en
or
la
make
primera hora.
comments on what
Les
was
ruego, por favor, guardar
discussed
sus
in the first
intervenciones
part.
para esa
Please
segunda
keep your
hora
your
para poder
interventions to the
primero escuchar a los
second portion
panelistas.
of the webinar so we can hear
Bueno,
them
sin más
first.
preámbulos,
Without further
abrimos la
ado,
conversa.
let's open the
La
discussion.
primera pregunta
The first question
es, ¿qué es el
is
contexto? ¿Qué
what
contexto es
is the
necesario
context or
para
what
comprender
context
los
is
esfuerzos
necessary to understand
actuales
the
de
current
reforma agraria en
efforts
Colombia?
for the
Yo
agrarian
como no había
reform
pensado en
in
el orden, no
Colombia?
sé si
I
Nuri
hadn't
quiere
thought about an order, but
quiere empezar.
perhaps Nuri from Pensuagro would like to begin?
Ok, gracias. Bueno,
Yes,
primero quiero
thank
decir
you.
que
First of all, I'd
intenté
like to say that
organizar
I've
el
tried to
video para que se me vea
organize
el rostro, pero
the
no
video so
logré.
you can see
Algo
my
pasa ahí,
face, but I
pero igual
actually
le tengo mi foto para
couldn't do it. I
sepan
apologize.
que estoy
My
hablando.
photo is
Ok.
here so
Bueno,
that you
primero quiero
know
agradecer mucho
that I
la
am
invitación.
speaking. I
Me
would like,
parece
first of all, to thank you
que
for
es
the
un tema
invitation.
bastante
I
importante
believe this
tenerlos
is a
en
very
cuenta que
important topic,
se va a hacer
bearing in
la
mind
Conferencia
that the
Internacional de Reforma
conference, the
Agraria y
International
Desarrollo
Conference
Rural,
on
que se va a
Agrarian
hacer en este
Reform, will
país,
take place
un
in
país
in Colombia,
que ha
a
sufrido
country that
una
has
guerra,
suffered a war
un conflicto social
and a
declarado desde hace
social
tanto
conflict,
tiempo
an armed
y
conflict
que el
for so
origen de
long.
eso tiene que
And the
ver
origin
con la
of this
tierra, con la
conflict has
propiedad
to
de la
do
tierra.
with
Entonces, me
land.
parece que
So
para
I
ver
believe
eso sí
that
es necesario
it is
reconocer
necessary
que
to
hace
understand
mucho tiempo,
that
¿cierto?
for very
Hace
long,
muchos años, porque
that
la propiedad
many
de la
years
tierra sí
ago, because the
o la
land,
concentración de
the,
la
or
propiedad
the
en este
concentration of
país
land
tiene raíces
ownership in this
coloniales, ¿no?
country has
Y
colonial
que se
roots,
consolidó pues a
and it
través
was
del
consolidated
latifundio
through
que ha limitado el acceso
a
para
law
millones
that
de
limited
campesinos
access
en
to
una
millions
deuda
and millions of
histórica
peasants, and this is
por parte de los
creates a
políticos, la
historical
distribución de la
debt,
tierra, la función social de la tierra,
and the social function
y
of
que se
the
han hecho
land is
leyes,
involved. So there are laws
leyes que se han llamado de
that were
reforma agraria
enacted
mm, bueno, que es completamente
that
distinta a la reforma
is
agraria que
totally
nosotros
different from the
hemos
agrarian
planteado como
reform that
movimiento
we have
campesino.
raised
Pero
or
estas leyes
brought up as a
no han logrado, por ejemplo, la ley
peasant or
200 del
rural
año
movement.
36,
But in the year
que introdujo leyes que
36, for
limitaban la
example, the
función
law that
social de la tierra
introduced social function of
y
the
que
land
quiso formalizar la propiedad de los
and wanted
colonos
to
en tierras y
formalize
hubo un retroceso.
property of the colonials
Una
was
vez
a
llegó el siguiente gobierno
setback.
y
After
se creó
that, the following
un
government
espacio que en Colombia se ha llamado
created a
la violencia,
space in
el periodo de
Colombia
violencia que para
called the
nosotros
period
empezó mucho antes
of
y mucho luego
violence, which
también,
for us
pero
dates further back.
todo lo contrario, fue un retroceso
But it was really a setback. It
se aumentó la
achieved the
criminalización y el
opposite, where
despojo y
criminalization
eso ha sido
uh, got
durante todo el tiempo.
worse
La ley
and
135 que creó el INCORA, que es el
dispossession
Instituto
increased
Colombiano
as
para la
well. So the
Reforma Agraria,
Colombian Institute
y
for
que
Agrarian
creó
Reform was created, and
o quiso entregar tierras al campesinado
wanted
también,
this institute wanted
fue
to
de alguna
award
manera
lands, and in a
frenada
way,
por el
it was
acuerdo que hubo en
stopped
Chicoral
by the
también por
agreement at
parte de los
Chicoral
terratenientes de
on
este
behalf
país,
of the
de la burguesía de
landowners
este
of the
país,
countries
y
and the
que frenó
bourgeois of the
un
country
compromiso de no hacer
that
reforma agraria y de
stopped a
no entregarle tierra a
commitment
los campesinos y
of
campesinas, y que ha
not
obligado,
delivering the
digamos,
land to the peasants, and
de
this
alguna manera
forced in
colonizar las
some
montañas, llegar
way
a sitios
to the
completamente
colonization of the mountains and arriving at
improductivos y que en este
places that
momento la
were
mayor
non-productive.
concentración
And at
esté
that
en
time,
muy poquitas
the
manos
concentration, or currently the
el
concentration,
campesinado
is
no
at
tenga
very
tierra.
few hands,
Igualmente es
and the
importante
peasants
plantear
don't
que
have land. It's important
el
to
despojo,
raise that
la
the
criminalización por el tema de la tierra
dispossession,
en
the
Colombia ha sido
criminalization of the
una
land in
cuestión
Colombia
permanente que no
has
ha
been a
terminado
permanent
y que la
issue that
tierra
is not
está
over,
utilizada
and the
para
land
el
is being
extractivismo
used for
que
extractivism,
está entregada al poder
which
corporativo
is
y que
given to the corporate power, and it
la tierra apta
also
para la agricultura pues la tienen
the land that
sobre todo
is
para el
good for
ganado, la ganadería
agriculture
extensiva
is
¿cierto?
more
Y
for
que
cattle
realmente no
raising
se le ha dado la
of an
importancia ni
extensive
a la soberanía
nature,
alimentaria ni lo que
and
significa
food
la producción de alimentos.
sovereignty
Y
or
los
food
tratados de libre
production
comercio,
has
pues
not
que
been given its
ha
importance.
ayudado, ¿sí?
This
Los
has
tratados de libre
helped.
comercio
The free trade
desafortunadamente van más allá
agreements
de la
unfortunately
Constitución
go beyond the
y no les
Constitution,
interesa la
and
soberanía
they're not
alimentaria ni
interested
la
in
producción de
food
alimentos.
sovereignty or
Y
the
la
good
mayoría de
production of
alimentos que
food.
podemos
And
producir en
most of
Colombia,
the
pues
foods
son
that we can
traídos
produce in Colombia are
de otros
brought
países que
from other
tienen
countries
que andar miles,
that
millas,
have to
kilómetros para llegar
walk
acá y que
thousands of miles
son
to get here, have
ultraprocesados y
to
todo
be
lo demás.
transported,
Entonces,
and they
en ese
are
momento
super processed.
no
So at
podemos hablar
this
de una
moment,
reforma
we
agraria que
cannot
no
really
tenga
talk
cambios
about an
estructurales,
agrarian reform that
¿sí?
doesn't have
Que
structural
realmente
changes
tengan en cuenta
and that
el
truly
acceso,
bears in
¿sí? No
mind
solamente a la tierra,
access,
sino al
not just
territorio, a
to
las
the land,
semillas,
but
al
to the
agua,
territory,
¿sí?
to the
Que
seeds, to
reconozca a
water,
los sujetos
that
sociales que
acknowledges
hay allí, al
social
campesinado, a los pueblos
conflicts, that
indígenas, a las
acknowledges the
comunidades negras,
indigenous and
¿sí?
peasant
Y
communities, the black
que haya una
communities,
legislación que
and
realmente
that there is
permita
a legislation that can
cumplir esa función social y que no
enable for
sea
that social
una
function to be
legislación que
fulfilled,
beneficie
and that it's
solamente
not just a
a un sector
legislation that
corporativo.
is gives benefits to the
Ay,
corporate
muchas
world.
gracias, Nuri.
Thank you so much,
El tiempo
Nuri.
perfecto.
That was
No
perfect
sé cómo
timing.
hizo
I'm
tanto
not sure
flujo ese
how you
tiempo y
did it.
cubrió mucho, mucho
And you
en cinco
covered quite a
minutos.
lot in five
Paso
minutes.
entonces a
I
Nuri
would
de
now like
CCJ
to hand over to Nuri from
para seguir con la misma
CCJ to
pregunta sobre
continue with the
contexto,
same
el
question on the
contexto que debemos tener en
context that
cuenta
we
cuando
need to
queremos
bear in mind
comprender
when
los
we wish to
efectos actuales de reforma
understand
agraria en el
the
país.
agrarian
Y
reform in
recordando que
Colombia at the
aunque hay muchas
moment,
colombianas acá,
remembering
también
that
hay muchas
even though there's
personas de
many
otros
Colombians
países que de
here,
pronto
there's also participants from
cosas que
other
nos pueden
countries
parecer
that
obvios
perhaps
de
things
pronto no
that
lo
we
son para
think are
otros.
obvious are
Entonces,
not
como
so obvious to
para
others.
ayudar a todos a
So
entender el
to
contexto
help
en que
everyone
vivimos. Muchas
understand the
gracias.
context in Colombia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to AGTR for this invitation to be here and participating in this space. Many thanks to my colleagues Jennifer and Nuri for this dialogue, this joint dialogue among women, which is so relevant nowadays for agrarian purposes because women are historically involved, and being in these spaces is a way of providing visibility to the role that we have played in society. And therefore, it's really important and special emphasis in rural women, peasant, indigenous women who have always been invisible. Their work as well as women, as fighting women, was so invisible. And so it's so important to have this reference and bear it in mind to begin. Let's say that from the present moment, when we speak about agrarian reform, a convergence of different points that Nuri Martinez has highlighted, it has to do with this historical inequality in the land ownership, armed conflicts that we still have in our country, with the multiplicity of armed actors which are related to the use of land, but also to multiple human rights violations for the populations living in the country. And it's always also important to highlight a large number of legal tools that we have had in our history, as Nuri has signed. Some of them have intended to organize productivity and more specifically about land ownership. We do not have an agrarian jurisdiction. It has never worked in Colombia. And with agencies that can deal with land conflicts. And this is always so important to highlight. And in the considering the armed conflict, social and political conflicts, this also brings many difficulties to the populations that are resisting in the territories. There has been a peace treaty in 2016 with minimal points so that we were able to make headway in the equitative distribution of land. We still have many difficulties to implement this peace agreement after 10 years. It's still really difficult to implement what the treaty says. Uh, from the standpoint of civil society, we're working so that it can be fulfilled because there are many difficulties in our daily lives. It's a big political change that we have in 2022 with a government which was not a traditional government from Celitis, which was closer. Now it's closer to the people, and it brings a different way of governing and speaking about agrarian topics and working with the territories and people to see how we can change the distribution of land and how to identify those who are living in the field and under which conditions. So there is a rural crisis, and unfortunately, in Colombia, we still have many difficulties at the institutional level to be able to implement all the laws, the agrarian laws, formalization of property. We still have in different moments of Gustavo Petro's government different figures regarding the topic of land and property. Sometimes we do not yet have clear figures. In 2018, Dani has a census of the population, but didn't take into consideration the peasants. And this is a factor that ends up um, being related to the land and the ways of governing for the rural fields. And the rural crisis is also connected to the subjects of special protection, which have to do with the peasants, which is recognized in 2023 as a political constitution. So it is a really, and this is an overall context that we have on the table, and I'm playing an important role now at the moment of taking action and working with agrarian reform. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Nuri.
Many thanks, Nuri.
Que hay tanto por decir que
There's so much to
creo que
say. I know.
alcanza en este tiempo,
I
pero
believe
bueno,
that
estamos,
the time is
creo
by far is
que
not enough, but I
cubriendo mucho
believe that
terreno en este poco
we
tiempo
have
y
been
muchas
a lot
gracias.
of ground on
Jenny.
in these minutes. Let's
Jennifer,
continue
por
with
favor, la
Jennifer.
misma pregunta, como
The
qué
same
contexto
question.
debemos tener en
What
cuenta
with
para
what
comprender
context do
los
we need to bear
procesos
in mind to understand
reforma
the
agraria actuales?
agrarian reform
Claro que sí,
processes in
gracias
the
John. En primer
present?
lugar, agradecerles a mis
Well, first of all,
colegas,
I'd like to
ponentes,
thank my
Nuri,
colleagues,
Gustavo y a los
Nuri
SJ,
and
también a
SJ,
Matthew y
as
a
well as
evidentemente
Matthew,
Francis,
and
quien
of
ayudó a
course
organizar
Francis, who
todo
have
este
helped
evento, y
set
a
up this
AGTER por hacer
event,
esto posible.
and
Respecto
AGTERF
al
for
contexto,
making
yo
it
creo
possible.
que
Regarding
podría
the
traer todos
context, I
algunos
believe
elementos intentando
that I could bring
complementar
a few
las
elements and
respuestas de
trying
mis
to
colegas.
complement the answers of
Creo
my
que es
colleagues.
importante situar
I
los
believe
temas a
it's
nivel
important to
internacional,
locate
porque
things at
esto
the
pone un
international
escenario
level as well, because this
difícil y
also
retador
brings a
para pensar la reforma
difficult,
agraria
challenging
en
scenario for
términos de
agrarian
las
reform,
políticas de
as
tierras.
well as in
A nivel
thinking about
internacional
land
estamos viendo
policies.
pues un giro sobre las
Internationally, we
derechas, un
see the
aumento
emergence
siempre
of
de
right
sueltos del
wings
control corporativo
and
sobre
corporate
tierras, sobre
control
recursos, sobre
over
aguas,
lands,
sobre
resources,
recursos
waters,
estratégicos, minerales
strategic
estratégicos, pero
minerals,
también sobre la
strategic minerals,
información y
as
los
well as
datos.
information and
Esto
data.
impacta de
And this
manera
has a
directa
big
las
and
políticas de
direct
tierras.
impact
Y en
on land
últimas, la reproducción
policies.
de la vida en sociedad,
And
cómo
finally, the
comemos,
reproduction of social
dónde
life, what we
habitamos,
eat,
cómo nos
where we
relacionamos,
live,
los
how we
intercambios en los
relate, the
contextos urbanos,
exchanges in
rurales, etc.
urban and rural
También vemos
contexts.
pues una
We also
debilidad
see
y
a
creo que
weakness and I
una falta de
believe
legitimidad
a
a
lack of
nivel internacional. Lo
legitimacy for
vimos
the
con el
international law. We saw
genocidio
it with the
contra el pueblo
genocide
palestino en
against
Gaza
the Palestine
y
people
también
in
lo
Gaza,
vemos
and we also
con
see it
esta extracción o
in this
este plan de pacificación que se
plan
quiere
of
hacer, que último es el
pacification
despojo
that
de
which
la
is
tierra y de
basically
sus
a
recursos.
removal and eviction of the
Entonces, en este contexto
of these people from
internacional
their
de
lands and
derechas y control
resources.
corporativo,
So we have the
se
corporate
abren unos
control,
retos
the right
muy
wings,
fuertes
and really
para
strong
pensar en las
challenges
políticas de
to
tierras
think,
orientadas hacia la
reflect about
vida, el
land
cuidado del
policies
alimento, la
and
sostenibilidad, la
life,
naturaleza
food,
y a la
sustainability,
disminución de
nature,
estas desigualdades
and how
estructurales.
to decrease these
También vemos
structural
claro el contexto
inequalities.
nacional en
We also
Colombia,
see the national
Colombia es uno de los
context in
países más
Colombia. It
desiguales
is
de la
one of the
región,
most
decían mis
unequal
colegas,
countries of the
un
region, as my
gobierno
colleagues said.
prolongado por más
A
de 6 décadas,
prolonged
con grupos muy diversos, grupos
six-decade armed
insurgentes, grupos
conflict with many
paramilitares,
groups,
grupos de
paramilitary
delincuencia
groups,
común,
criminal
y es un
groups as
conflicto que
well.
se ha venido
And it is a
reconfigurando
conflict that has been
pues por
reconfigured
diferentes periodos.
through
Si
different
reafirmamos la paz,
periods.
ya nos lo decía
We
Nuri,
affirm
en
peace and we say,
2016
Nuri, in
tuvimos una muy
2016,
buena
we had a window of opportunity where we have breathed something about peace in some territories of the country, but then the situation changed because the government, the Duque government, was hostile and did not want peace, and it said it would somehow break with the peace agreement. But when Gustavo Petro's government emerged and tried to, we had lost the window of opportunity, and now it's a task of this government, a difficult thing. And I believe that the measures and procedures that they have advanced on behalf of agrarian reform and land redistribution policies and nature, there are many actions and many results, and I will be speaking about them further on. So what do we have? We have a context, an international context of land grabbing and control, a national context of a political opportunity for redistribution, and a subnational context, which is really interesting. I believe that over these years and after the peace process, we have strengthened the peasant movements. We have the indigenous movements, and there's a lot to do, I know, and there are strong differences, and these differences we have called we they have allowed us to unite as a social class on behalf of land restitution in a country that's so unequal as ours. And that brings us together in topics related to the peace agreement. So I believe that we have two faces of the same coin, a context with many challenges as well as many opportunities. And I believe that we have seen the current context. And I conclude my 30 seconds, the remaining seconds, speaking about this context in Colombia. We are in an elections year, consultations in March, and then elections further on. And we're standing before a crossroads because it's the opportunity of defending, of protecting the advances that we have, the steps forward that we've had in the current government in terms of land and rural policies. And we also have the possibility of a threat to some of these advancements. These are my final words in this moment.
Muchas gracias, Jenny.
Many thanks, Jenny.
Seguimos con la
Let's
siguiente
continue
pregunta.
with the next question.
Y ya esta es sobre
It's
lo que
about
está pasando ahora,
what's
en
taking place
Colombia.
right now
¿Cuáles son los
recently, which
principales
are the
componentes de la
main
reforma
components of
agraria en
the
Colombia?
current agrarian
¿Qué se ha
reform in
logrado hasta la
Colombia,
fecha?
and what has it attained
Entonces,
to this
no había
date?
pensado en este del orden,
I
pero yo
had
creo que voy a
I
seguir
believe
en el
that I
mismo
will
orden,
continue with the same
si
order of
desea.
speakers if you don't have any
Entonces,
objections to it.
Nuri de Fensuagro, si
Nuri
quiere
Defensuagro,
comenzar, por
if
favor,
you'd like to begin, please.
¿cuáles son los principales
Which are the
componentes de la
main
reforma agraria
components
actual
of
en
the
Colombia
current
y qué se ha
agrarian
logrado
reform in
hasta la fecha?
Colombia, and what have they
Bueno,
achieved to
bien,
this point?
entonces, en
Well,
la primera intervención hablé
in
de
the
la
first
vigente ley
intervention, I
60,
believe
que es
I spoke
la
about the
ley de
60s
reforma
and the
agraria
law of
vigente en ese
agrarian
momento.
reform that we have at that
En esa
moment.
ley
And in this
tenemos
law,
unos artículos que nunca
one
se,
of
se
the
tomaron en cuenta.
articles,
Bueno, primero,
first of
allí
all,
se reconoció, digamos, la
it
figura territorial
recognizes the
de campesinos, lo que
territorial
fueron las
figure
organizaciones
of
campesinas.
peasants and
Durante
peasant
todo ese
lands.
periodo,
And during
solamente se
this
reconocieron 6
period,
zonas de reserva
only
agrícola y la
6
mayoría ya habían,
peasant
eran
reserves
legales.
have been
El campesinado
recognized,
se organizaban
and
porque el
while the
mandato,
peasants were
los
being
gobiernos anteriores no
organized,
los reconocieron.
and the previous
Y también
governments
estuvo el acuerdo de paz
didn't
de 1900
recognize
más o
it.
menos,
And we also have the
que
peace
también hace
agreement with the
plantearse
first
que
point,
durante ese
which is
periodo
important to say
realmente
who during
no
this
se
period,
implementó. Si
what
se
has
hizo un
not been
balance
implemented. There has been a
antes del
balance
gobierno Petro,
before the Petro
se hizo un
government.
balance de la implementación del
There was
acuerdo
a
de paz
balance of the
y el que
implementation
menos
of the
avanzó
peace
fue el
agreement, and the
punto
one that
3 del
least
prototipo,
advanced was the point number 1,
reforma agraria y desarrollo rural con enfoque
agrarian
territorial.
reform and
Igualmente está el
development with
tema
a focus on
del sujeto
territories.
del sujeto
And also
campesino,
the
no se
topics of
reconocía en la
peasant
Constitución del
subjects, which
91,
have not
solamente se reconocían
recognized
los
in the
pueblos indígenas y
1991
comunidades negras
constitution.
y
Only
como
indigenous and
decía
African
Hugo
Colombian
Tocaya,
communities were recognized then.
también
And
hubo
there was also there were actions from the peasants to attain the recognition that they wanted, and some jurisprudence in 2018 and the conceptualization of peasants during this period. And this current government has arrived, and we have three important things since then. First of all, the recognitions of peasants as a subject to a special constitutional protection. There was a constitutional amendment and Articles 65 and 66 recognizing the peasants and different dimensions, both cultural, organizational, territorial, productive dimensions, and access to land individually and collectively, which were not taken into consideration before. And we also have the a national plan of development implementing and including the peace agreement provisions and some elements that have been built, and recognizing and the creating a mixed commission with of the peasants dialoguing with the government in such way that we can have initiatives to implement the agrarian reform and the adjustments, the institutional adjustments that are necessary. And it's also implementing the national agrarian reform system involving the great majority of the institutional aspects that are related to land, production, environment, and health, justice. It's very important in the implementation of this system, which was in the law 160, but was not taken into account before. And the same in Administrative Act number 1 on agrarian jurisdiction, first of all, establishes special forces to deal with the conflicts that may occur considering the formal aspects and the violence that there was taking place, land grabbing and territorial aspects. So some important things have been created, some policies considering the topic of agroecology, family agriculture, and peasant family and community agriculture. But the Congress of the Republic, the courts that we have in Colombia, they have restricted it. The implementation of these features have not enabled the advancement, above all, of land redistribution. And they have restricted, for instance, the ANT took away the Article 61 of the National Development Plan, which does not allow the ANT to appropriate or recover the land that for proprietors, large proprietors, landowners. So advancements have been taking place in terms of recognition of the subjects of rights and recognizing the territorial figures, because we do have these figures, and such as the indigenous lands, community councils for African Colombian communities, and peasant reserves and agroalimentarian territories for peasants, as well as the water-related territories. So we have had important initiatives, and it's part of a political commitment, but we need the political commitment of the courts and the Congress as
Bueno,
well.
Nuri, muchas gracias. Muchos temas
Thank you
ahí
so much, Nuri. So much
para
to
luego hacer
talk about.
preguntas. Yo ya dio
And then
la
we'll have time
primera
for
pregunta.
questions. I'm already taking note of some.
Nuri de CCJ, por
Nuri from
favor,
CCJ, please
si
go
puede
ahead.
seguir
If you
con la
could
misma pregunta,
continue with
¿cuáles
the
son los
same
principales
question, what
componentes
are
de la
the
reforma
main
agraria actual en
components of the
Colombia
agrarian
y
reform
qué se ha
currently in
logrado hasta la
Colombia, and
fecha?
what has been achieved to date?
Pues nosotros
Thank you
desde la
so
Comisión
much.
Colombiana de
At
Juristas
the Juris
nos hemos
Commission in
ocupado
Colombia,
con el
we've
gobierno actual
identified that in the current
trabaja
government,
desde la Agencia Nacional de
we
Tierras,
work at the National Land
el
Agency, the
acceso
component
a
that
la
has to do with
tierra, la
access to
formalización de la
land, to the
propiedad,
formalization
bueno,
of
pues digamos que ese es el
property,
GER que trabaja en
of
ese
land
sentido con las
ownership. And we
reformas
feel that there are other
en
issues to
materia de
be
derechos productivos, creo que son
worked
varios. Es que hay
on
una buena
for the
voluntad
peasants,
en
but there is
Colombia
goodwill
desde el
in
gobierno,
terms
digamos, en
or
muchas
from the
cosas que se
government in terms
implementan
of the policies
frente
that are
a
being
la
implemented.
ruralidad y a la necesidad
Uh,
de los sujetos
with the needs of the peasants. But the goodwill is not enough, however. There is a lot of difficulty in identifying what are those figures, the real numbers, as to the formalization of land ownership and access to land. We also found a great difficulty with regards to legal security for peasants in their relationship to land. So for us, it is important to move forward in these scenarios as Nuri was describing with regard or in relation to the national institutions and the implementation of the agrarian reform. But at the same time, it's important to move forward and to follow up rigorously, which is not the case for each one of the cases. Regularization with regards to land ownership and access to land. So the component of agrarian reform for us is not consolidated yet. There is still a lot to do in identification, in understanding what the situation is, what are the laws that can be part of the agrarian reform. The National Agency of Lands has informed us that cattle raisers in the country that have the most land have offered lands to the National Agency, but these are unused lots. They're not even lands that could be sold to the state because they belong to the state and have been never recovered. So there is a failure there. We don't have the stock of these unused lands or empty lots, and this also makes it harder for us to move forward with the agrarian reform. There are difficulties as well when it comes to counting and identifying how the agrarian reform will take place. Sometimes we have families being counted, sometimes it's hectares being considered, sometimes it's numbers of procedures. So all of this makes it a little bit difficult to do a follow-up of this goodwill, of these good intentions. But for us, it's really important to make this visible. Thank you.
Bueno, gracias, Nuri.
Thank you
Terminó
so
antes de
much,
tiempo, pero bueno, eso
Nuri.
nos permite luego
You
más,
still
más
have a
tiempo
little bit
para
of time, but that
preguntas y
allows us for
discusión.
more time for questions and discussions
Jenny, por
later.
favor, la
Jenny,
gente pregunta,
please, the
¿cuáles
same
son los
question.
principales
What are
componentes de
the
la
main
reforma agraria actual
components
en
of the
Colombia y
agrarian
qué se ha
reform
logrado
currently in
hasta la
Colombia
fecha?
and what has been
Yo
achieved so far?
rescato lo que obviamente han
I
resaltado
take
ya mis
what has
compañeros,
been
pero me
highlighted by
gustaría irme un
my
poquito más atrás
colleagues, but I'd
y
like to
es el
go back a
tema
little
del
bit
desmonte de la
and to
institucionalidad
talk
agraria en
about the
Colombia. Y que creo que es un
institutionality of the
fenómeno
agrarian reform
solamente
being dismantled.
nuestro,
This
sino que también
wasn't
funciona a
just
nivel
our
global.
phenomena, this is a
Entonces, cuando
global
van cayendo
phenomenon.
muchos de los Estados
So when
Unidos
many
para
of
resurgir el
the
movimiento
well-being
neoliberal,
states
la consecuencia
fall and
directa
the
sobre el mundo agrario
neoliberal
fue el debilitamiento de la
institution
institucionalidad agraria.
arises,
Entonces
we have the
veníamos de reformas
weakening
agrarias
of the
clásicas
agrarian
en los
reform. We
60,
had
70,
in the
décadas del
60s and
siglo pasado, unas más exitosas
70s,
que
some
otras,
more successful
pero
than
con grandes
others,
efectos
but
positivos en
with
la reducción de
great
la
positive
pobreza,
effects
en
to
aumento del
reduce
crecimiento económico
poverty
y
and
procesos de
increase
desarrollo
financial
impresionantes en
growth
aquellos
and
países que
development in
cumplieron
those
tarea e
countries that
hicieron su reforma agraria
actually
clásica.
did
Hay
their
tres
classic
componentes en la
agrarian
reforma
reform.
agraria.
There are three
Primero,
components to this. First
cambiar
of
la
all,
estructura agraria
changing
desigual. Eso
the
implica
agrarian
quitarle
structure
a
that
los que
is
tienen
unequal,
muchísima
to
tierra
take from those
y
that have a
dársela a
lot
quienes
and
no la
give
tienen
it to
o a
those that
las que
don't have
tienen
land
insuficiente.
or that have
En
insufficient.
Colombia
In
tenemos un
Colombia,
Gini de
we
tierras de
have
0,89.
a
Tenemos políticos que recorren
0.89
sus tierras
index.
en
We have
avioneta
politicians
porque son
that
tan
go
grandes
through
que
their
quisieran
land
hacer
by
3 municipios.
plane because they're
Piensen
simply
ustedes en la
too
finca Bella Cruz y
too
muchos ejemplos
vast. Think
icónicos que
about,
podríamos
and there
hablar
are
aquí,
many
pero no
examples
tenemos
that we could
tiempo.
discuss here, but we don't have time.
Entonces,
So Aside from the redistribution of land and making the structure equal, we need to place floors and ceilings. So that is what is the maximum amount of land one can have and what's the minimum amount of land that one can have. Those are the main three elements of a classic agrarian reform. But the world has changed, and it changed with a reduction of the capacity of the state. So in the current context, we have to think about redistribution policies that answer to two elements. First one, to the global context, an environmental crisis, climate crisis, food crisis, and so forth, but also to conditions in the Colombian case of war and of a deep weakening of the institutions for distribution. So I think in this government, aside from what has been already discussed by my colleagues, the task is to reconstitute the state for redistribution, for pro-peasant policies, for pro-communities, and popular policies. We lost institutions such as IDEMA that were in charge of controlling food prices and generating processes and to help the peasants when there were extenuating circumstances and brought negative consequences to the peasants. We lost all that. We lost the ability to do public policies and social policies that were truly focused on the generation of food, of looking after the nature, and we went all the way to extractivist development. So I think one of the main purposes of this government has been to rebuild that agrarian reform through what Nuri mentioned, through or against legislative stream or branch that doesn't want this to happen. Our country really has a number of barriers for the ordinary law of the agrarian reform not to pass. So I think that in the midst of this window of opportunity with this government, we have an opportunity to think about the planning long term when it comes to land, based on the redistribution, of course, but also on policies that go beyond the agrarian reform. I'll leave it at that.
Muchas gracias,
Thank you
Jennifer.
so much,
Bueno,
Jenny.
yo tengo muchas preguntas, pero
I have many
tengo que
questions,
contener hasta el
but I'm
final.
gonna have to
Vamos con
wait
la
until
tercera
the end.
pregunta.
Let's move on to the third
¿Qué
question.
falta en los esfuerzos
What's
actuales de la reforma
missing
agraria y cuáles
in
son
the
los
current
principales
efforts, and what
desafíos
are the main
para los próximos
challenges
años?
for the next
Entonces,
few
Nuri
years?
de Fensuagro,
Nuri
por
from
favor, si quiere
Fensuagro,
empezar
please, if
esta
you'd
ronda.
like to begin.
Ok, bien. Ay, bueno, eso falta mucho.
Wow, there's
Por
a
todo lo que
lot
está
missing
diciendo
still for
la profesora
everything
Jennifer,
that Jennifer
porque
has just
pues
mentioned,
son problemas
because
estructurales
these are
lo que se tienen.
structural issues
Y se
that we
tiene que
have to
cambiar
bear in
eso.
mind and we have to change.
Ahí tiene que haber
There has to be
hay que resolver estructuralmente
we
eso
have to
para
resolve
que
this
realmente se
structurally
pueda
so that
tener
we
una
can
reforma agraria
truly
donde
have an
la tierra
agrarian
cumpla su
reform
función
where the
social,
land
donde
fulfills
haya
its social
reconocimiento y
function,
donde haya
where there
manejo del
is
alimento.
recognition and food
Nosotros
production.
planteamos que
We raise
primero que
that,
todo tiene que haber un
first of
cambio
all, there needs
institucional
to
para
be an
recuperar
institutional adjustment
la
to recover
institucionalidad
the
agraria, pero no solamente
institutionality, but
hablándose
not
de producción,
just when
tierra y
it
eso,
comes to
sino todo lo que tiene
production
que
and
ver
land,
con la
everything that
posibilidad
has to
frente al tema
do
ambiental,
with
frente al tema de educación, de
institutionality,
salud,
when it
infraestructura,
comes to
todo lo que
health,
implica
education,
una
infrastructure,
reforma agraria
everything that an
integral.
agrarian reform in an
Tenemos que pensar
integrated
en la
way
matriz productiva. No
includes. We need
podemos
to think
seguir
about the productive
produciendo de
matrix.
la
We're going
forma
to
que estamos
continue to
haciendo en
produce
este
in the
momento
way that we are
con la
currently doing
cantidad de
so
agrotóxicos,
with
con
the
la
amount of
cantidad de ultraprocesados.
agrotoxins and
Y eso significa,
super
y para
processed foods.
conservar
And
la
this
biodiversidad
means, and to keep the
y
biodiversity
conservar el
and
planeta,
and
en este
protect the
momento
planet,
la humanidad tiene un
because
riesgo por la producción de
humanity
alimentos
has a
que es muy
risk for the
importante,
production of
la
food that
producción de
is
alimentos
truly
a nivel
important at
internacional,
the
que es
international level,
industrial y contamina,
which is
¿sí?
industrial
Y
and
ayuda
it
mucho al calentamiento
pollutes
global, entonces
and it
esto va a
has
ser muy
negative
importante.
effects on global
Tenerse en
warming. So this
cuenta
is important.
un
So we
comercio
need to
justo.
keep this in
Y
mind. We
cuando
need to
hablamos
keep in
de
mind
comercio
a
justo, tiene
fair trade. And when we talk about
que
fair trade,
fortalecerse las
it
cadenas productivas
needs we need to
cercanas, ¿sí?
strengthen the
Cercanas.
close
Y
productive
también es muy
chains.
importante que haya
And we also
autonomía de los
need to
pueblos,
have autonomy
soberanía,
or
soberanía
sovereignty. The
frente
peoples need to have
al comercio.
sovereignty
Tiene que haber
when it
justicia frente al
comes
comercio a nivel
to
internacional.
commerce
No
and
puede
international
utilizarse
trade.
los
We
alimentos
cannot
como un arma de guerra como está pasando
use
en
food
Palestina.
as a
Eso significa que
weapon
tiene
of
que
war as it
plantear como
happens in
Colombia tiene
Palestine.
y
So
pelear a nivel
we need
internacional
to fight
el
at the
sistema
international
agroalimentario
level
que
and at
sí
the
se ha desarrollado,
Colombian
que se ha
level
construido.
what the
El
current
reconocimiento de las figuras
structure is.
territoriales
We
es
have to
supremamente
acknowledge
importante que
the
la comunidad
territorial
en el
figures. It's
territorio
important for the
sea
community in the
autónoma
territories to
para
be autonomous,
organizarse,
to organize
autoorganizarse, ¿sí?
themselves,
Y que el Estado
self-organize,
apoye esa
and that the
autoorganización,
state
que
supports that
los planes de desarrollo sean
self-organization,
autosostenibles
and that
y
the
sean
plans are
desarrollados de manera colectiva y el Estado asuma la responsabilidad
sustainable and that are
que le
built
corresponde
with the
para poder
responsibility that they
implementarse.
are
Entonces, tiene que haber
that they
un
deserve.
relacionamiento
There
mucho más
also
fuerte
needs
entre
to
campo y la
be a
ciudad.
much
Los
stronger
problemas del
relationship
campo no son
between
de
the
la
rural
ciudad.
area and the
Los
cities. The
problemas del
problems
campo
are
es de la
not
sociedad en
of
su conjunto
just of
y es
the
muy
fields,
importante
but
esa
of the
cercanía entre el campo y la
society
ciudad,
as a
entre
whole. So we need
productores y
to
consumidores,
bridge this
¿sí?
gap
Que
between
tenemos
consumers and
todo un
producers. We
compromiso
have the commitment,
para,
we have a
de
commitment,
ecosocial, por decirlo de
an
alguna manera,
eco-social commitment
para que
to
funcione
name it in
la
a
vida,
way
para que funcione el
so that
planeta. Entonces,
life takes
me
place
parece
and
que
works
hay
and the planet works. So I think there's still a
hay
lot,
todo que hacer para que realmente haya
actually
una
still
reforma
everything
agraria
to be
integral,
done for an integral
democrática,
urban
popular
reform
y
to
que
take
pueda
place that
revertir
is
los problemas
democratic, that is popular,
estructurales para
and that
poder
we can see
lograrlo.
structural changes to achieve it.
Bueno, gracias, Nuri.
Thank you,
También
Nuri.
otra vez antes de tiempo, pero
Also ahead
nos
of
da mucho
time,
tiempo
but
para
that
conversar
will allow
y
for us to
dialogar
discuss
con los demás
and
participantes.
and talk a little bit later.
Entonces, Nuri, de
Nuri from
CCJ,
CCJ, please go
la
ahead.
pregunta es sobre los retos,
The question is on the
los principales
challenges,
desafíos
the
para los
main
próximos
challenges
años
for the
y
next
qué
few
falta
years,
darse en
and
los
what's
espacios actuales, que
missing,
creo
what
que
is yet to
ya
be
empecé a
done.
tocarlo también
I think that
en la
you
pregunta anterior.
started to touch on this in the
Gracias.
last question.
Muchas gracias.
Yes, thank
Bueno,
you.
este tema de qué falta
This
es muy
topic of
largo.
what's missing is
Hay
actually
muchas cosas todavía por hacer
it's quite long.
desde
There are many things
la
that could be
normatividad
done
tenemos
from
bastante
the norms, the
reconocimiento
guidelines. We
legal de
have
procedimientos
legal
de
recognition and
procedimientos históricos que se
jurisprudence
han hecho varios
recognition.
países en relación con
We've
ampliar y
had
reconocer la
the
ruralidad,
recognition
los
of
sujetos de especial protección,
rurality and the subjects that
habitando
need
los territorios y
protection, that are
desarrollando su
inhabit
sostenibilidad,
these
pero
territories.
falta mucha
But
voluntad política,
there's
sí, cierto,
still a lot of political
falta
will to take
un
place, to
reconocimiento
exist.
real a
We're
la
missing a real
territorialidad
recognition
campesina, por
to the
ejemplo,
peasant territoriality, for example,
sujetos que están
when the
allí en sus
subjects that are
lugares
there, men and
disponen
women,
cómo dar uso a ciertos recursos
think
naturales
how
en el
certain
territorio,
natural resources
disponen
can be
cómo aligerar
used
o dividir
or
las
how
tierras
to
en su comunidad.
divide
Ese
the lands, distribute the
reconocimiento
lands in
político
their
es muy
communities.
importante
That is very
porque da
important
relevancia
because
social
it
a la
awards
territorialidad
relevance to
campesina,
the
cómo se
peasant
ejerce la autonomía
territoriality
de
and
esa
how it's
comunidad de
exercised
la
with
tierra y creo que se
autonomy.
queda,
I
digamos, en el
think
discurso de la
that is
normatividad como que
left
debe ser,
in the
pero en la realidad
speeches, but in
no se
actual
atiende a ello.
fact, in
Y
practical
digamos,
terms, it
ponemos
has
como
not
casos
been
muy
achieved.
prácticos
And
el
we
caso
see
del
this in
cultivo y el
practical
ecoservicio
cases
ante la
day to
zona de
day
tierras,
because
especialmente en
we
las
are
comunidades
involved
que
in the
son
cases
territoriales.
when it comes
El
to
problema que
land
tiene Colombia es
restitution. The
histórico,
issue of
pero
land in
adicional
Colombia is
cuando se
historical,
presentó
but
el grave momento de
when the grave
1995 y los
moment in
desplazamientos
2005
colombianos, digamos, como la zona
took
más fuerte
place,
de desplazamiento en Colombia,
we
pues se perdieron
see
también
we lost
esas oportunidades del campesinado para acceder a la tierra.
opportunities to
Y en
access
esa
land
medida
by
se
the
perdieron
peasants.
también
And
esas
so we also
condiciones de la
lost the
tierra.
ways
Y
to take
en
over the
2011,
land
cuando
or
se
to
establece en Colombia
distribute the land. In
el
2011, when the
derecho a
law
la
for
cultivación
land
y las
restitution
restituciones, que un
was
juez federal,
enacted,
digamos, pone al Estado en
that
sintonía de
places the
devolver
state in
a
the
las
position
personas
to
que
give back to
perdido
those that had
cultivo,
lost their
devolverles la
land
posibilidad de vivir
and to provide
legalmente.
them with the
Digamos,
right
se
to take
hace
it back.
un
We
análisis
have an
sobre lo que se
analysis in
pierde,
relation to
pero
what's lost.
cuando
But
15 años
when
después
15
vemos
years later
qué ha
we
pasado, pues
see what's
hay
happened,
un tema de la
there
territorialidad
is
que
an
está
issue
siendo
of
desconocida
territoriality
y es
that is
la
being
diferencia de eso es un poco
unknown.
los
So the limits imposed by the communities, the use of natural resources is not being recognized by the Colombian state, and it's really important in terms of agrarian reform, right? So let's say that access to land is also access to the use of resources, right? So we have an important path to tread because it implies the protection of environment. We cannot speak about the environment without considering the subjects. So it's a big challenge that we have, considering what's still missing, and agrarian reform, which are the challenges, as well as placing into sync the needs of the subjects inhabiting the land and the future. But let's say that we still lack in terms of agrarian reform the clear accounts for the subjects of special protection who are inhabiting the rural areas, peasants, indigenous, and others. Because we have, for instance, a specific case, I'll speak about it, and the reality that we have and the rules that we have. Uh, we everything seems to be safe, but when we face the cases effectively, we realize that we're not so safe as it seems. So a recent example that we have regarding in Veracruz peasant community in the department of Cesar in Colombia, it is a community that inhabited territories, empty territories, which were defined as such, and they were displaced from their territorial places in the 1990s. Subsequently, the community, considering the restitution land, requires the Colombian state to restitute the lands to them, and those lands are not eligible anymore for the peasant development because they had been used by the industry of palm oil. So let's say that the society, an entrepreneurial group with foreign investment implemented a palm oil project, and that has made problems and contamination and water issues. And after the community required the restitution of the land, and all this process began in the courts. It's about 10 years so far. And with the new government in the landmark of granting land to the peasants that need it, and the agrarian reform that's being implemented, and it requires to adopt that these families can have access to the land. It is established with the possibility of giving them some buildings also in the Cesar, which are private lands, which are object of an extension of dominion. So the use of these lands do not correspond to the legal aspects, and we have an extinction of dominion procedures. And in these procedures, the Society of Special Assets, which was working with these buildings, decided to grant provisionally to the peasants approximately 1,100 hectares, and with the National Land Agency, so that these lands can be formally assigned to this institution and then assigned to the peasants. This occurred in 2023, but 3 years later, now, despite of the clear procedures and the need of the peasant population in this case, the peasants do not yet have the legal safety of these lands because the Society of Special Assets hands it to them provisionally with a title, and the public prosecution office requires that if the goods can be taken from the property of the person who are using it, um, and it provides that the lands will be returned to their proprietors because those were the ones that were connected to the drug business, and and people say that they don't have a way to live, and there is not a rigorous analysis of how these buildings are. And that's part of the legally under the peasants at this moment, and will return to the custody of their proprietors. So this is taking place 1 year later. People's living in the peasant territories And it was said to them that they could be proprietors of these lands collectively, and the land agency will buy the property of assets. And then we have extinction procedures in Colombia, and the public entities can buy these lands. And now I'm about to conclude, okay? And the National Land Agency begins a process of negotiation with the Special Asset Society, which is materialized that after the peasants were made visible in this case. But 1 year after this, in 2025-26, the National Land Agency has not yet delivered the land security to these people. And this is one of the cases that shows, one of the cases of the successful cases for peasants, land for the peasants under the agrarian reform. So we are concerned, and in Colombian, we have the parallel procedure, legal aspects which were really well structured on one side, but on the other hand, the procedures are not aligned to this reality, and people do not have their rights materialized. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Nuri. Es que
Many thanks, Nuri.
deje pasar el tiempo porque me parece
I'm sorry because
impactante
I
un
let the
caso
time
concreto
pass
y
because it was
yo
important
la
to
verdad
hear how
quería
a
saber
concrete
cómo
case
terminaba
was,
esto,
and
pero
I wanted to
igual
know how
estamos
the
muy en el
story
tema,
ended,
entonces me
and
parece muy
we're
interesante
kind of
escucharlo.
ahead
Sí
of
he
our time, so
preguntado a un
I
caso
felt it was
específico.
interesting to hear this
Bueno, Jenny,
specific case.
la
Now,
última pregunta
Jenny, the final
es
question to
¿qué
you.
falta en los esfuerzos
What's
actuales
missing in the
de la
current
reforma agraria para los
efforts of the
años
agrarian reform, and which are the main
para los
challenges
años
that you
que
see for the
Bien, yo creo
upcoming
que desafíos son
years?
muchos,
I believe there are many
pero yo soy,
challenges, but I
por
am
naturaleza lo soy, una
by
persona
nature
que ve el
a
vaso
person
medio lleno.
who is sees
Y
the
yo creo que,
half
por ejemplo, este
full
caso que
cup.
hablaba Nuri
And I
muestra muchos de
believe
los
that in this
desafíos,
case
pero
that Nuri
yo también
shows
estoy
us,
muy
it shows
interesada
the
y hay que
challenges,
tomar
but I'm also
prestancia
interested, and
de,
I'll
de
take,
Nuri
I
esa
will
facultad.
enter
Y
this
cuando lo hacía,
SSJ
pues que
case,
la SAE,
and I'd
por
like to
ejemplo, la
show
Sociedad de
that
Cultivos
SAE, the
Especiales,
Special
llegara,
Asset
siquiera
Society,
a agarrar tierra,
the fact that it was
recuperada
in
de la
charge
mafia,
of land that was
tierra mala,
recovered from the
digamos, que fue
mafias,
usada para lavado de activos,
that was used
recuperarla y
for
darla a organizaciones
asset
campesinas,
washing.
eso
It
es
recovered it
insólito.
and
Y eso no
gave
es
it to
algo
the
menor. En
peasant
Colombia,
communities.
la Sociedad de Cultivos
This is not a
Especiales
small
era
thing.
cooptada
In
por
Colombia, this
partidos políticos en
society was
nuestro país,
co-opted by political
por
parties in our
narcotraficantes.
countries
Imagínense
and the drug
ustedes.
dealers.
De pronto
So
para los
can you
colombianos
imagine?
esto ya está
For us
muy bien sabido,
Colombians,
pero para la
this is
audiencia
well known,
internacional,
but
la
for
SAE
international
hace unos
people,
años era
SAE
un
for a few
centro de
years ago
corrupción.
was a corruption
Yo diría
center. And
que
I'd
la
say that
reforma agraria, eso es un avance
agrarian reform, this
importantísimo,
is an
eso no
important
lo queremos
advance,
en ningún
a
momento
really
minimizar
important one.
ni,
I
ni
don't want
negar.
to minimize it.
Y antes de decir un poco los
And before
desafíos que nos falta,
saying
señor
some things
Pequeño,
about the challenges
yo sí
and what's
quisiera
missing,
comentar algunas de
I'd
las
like to
cifras.
comment on the figures.
Los demás están escuchando a Jenny
Are
entrecortada.
you also
Sí,
see
escuchamos
Jenny?
entrecortada a
Are you
Jenny.
listening to
Qué
Jenny?
mal, ¿desde
Sí,
cuándo?
sí.
Okay,
No, desde siempre
El
no,
comienzo.
not
No, no, no. Sí,
uh,
desde
w-
cuando
uh,
estabas hablando
as
de
when you
la
were speaking
corrupción en la
about
SAE.
the corrupt
Ah,
image of
bien.
SAE. Okay,
Bien, les
that's
estaba
when it
diciendo,
cut
y
from me.
ya,
I
ya
was
los me
telling you.
escuchan bien, de pronto fue
Yes,
mi
now
internet.
can you hear me
Sí,
well?
por
I have an
internet.
internet
Ya está
issue,
bien.
right? It's working
Les
now.
decía que,
I was saying that
que la transformación de
the
algunas entidades que eran un
transformation of
centro
some
malo de
entities
corrupción, como la
which
SAE,
were corruption centers
ha sido
before,
una
just like
conquista,
SAE,
y
that
que
has
la
been a
SAE,
conquest
que
for us.
fue una
And
entidad
SAE,
muy
that was an
corrupta,
entity, a
hoy
really
está
corrupt one,
también dentro de su
nowadays,
misionalidad
also
pensando
under
en la
its
reforma
mission, has
agraria
been
y en
thinking about
recuperar los bienes de la
agrarian
mafia para
reform,
entregarlos a las
recovering
organizaciones
mafia
campesinas y
assets,
un
and
avance
delivering them to the
considerable que no
peasants. So
se
this
debe
has been a
minimizar.
considerable
Y les
advancement,
decía que
and we
antes de hablar
cannot
de los
minimize
retos,
it.
quería
And
hablar de
before
algunas
speaking about the
cifras.
challenges, I'd like to
Yo creo
mention a few
que tenemos
figures.
muchas
I
razones
believe,
para
Nuri,
preocuparnos
you
los
are right
colombianos sobre
to
las
say that
cifras
we
en
have
Colombia.
problems
No
about the
tenemos
figures
todo el
in
detalle
Colombia.
de
For instance,
de las
we
tierras
do
que
not
tienen
have the
actualizadas.
inventory of empty
Hay
lands,
un
an
atraso
updated one.
fenomenal
There
en
was a
el paso de
phenomenal
tierras.
delay
Eso
in
lo
the register of lands. But when we look in compared perspective to the achievements in terms of formalization of property, delivery of lands, and special processes for land issues that were solved, and we compared them in this government with the previous government's results, so we can see a really significant advancement, truly. And in terms of formalization, in the 6 years, 2 of the Santos government after the peace agreement and 4 years of the Duque governments, compared to the almost 4 years of the Petro government, we see a huge advancement, land formalization. Now we're speaking that in the first 6 years, about 720,000 hectares were formalized. And in this government, we have 1,900 hectares were formalized. This is not a small feat. And it's not only about political will, but concrete change and the establishment of conditions so that this could be possible. Also regarding the percentage and the figures of the lands delivered to peasant and ethnic communities, we see that in the 6 years, the previous years, approximately 17,000 hectares. It's a small figure. And in this government, we see 286,000 hectares delivered. In topics, for instance, of special agrarian procedures that was solved for the international community, what's this? These special processes, these are the mechanisms through which the state recovers the lands, they bring it to a land fund, and then redistributes these lands to peasants and ethnic communities. These special agrarian issues include dominion extension, the recovery of public or empty lands that were unduly taken by people who were not subjects of agrarian reform. So you imagine what has happened. Senators and entrepreneurs who were owners of lands that were meant for peasants. So we started solving these agrarian special process despite all the barriers, so that these special processes were solved by the court procedures, and we needed additional time to explain it. So I'll take 30 seconds, Francis, to speak about some challenges. I believe that the first challenge is moving from an agrarian reform from the market to a real redistributive agrarian reform. In 1990, with the economic opening and the global change, we weren't speaking about a classical agrarian reform, but we were speaking about a market agrarian reform, where the market was not so much involved to redistribute it, and the state was an spectator and somebody that safeguarded the contracts of those who bought and sold. So it was a market formula and the state gave subsidies of 70% and a credit for 30% so that these land transactions could take place. And this is the law nowadays. I'm not saying that the law 160 does not cover important aspects. It does. We have special reserves and zones and many other positive things in the law. But the first challenge is moving from that market agrarian reform to a really effectively redistributed agrarian reform with 3 components. First, recovering an institutionality which is able to redistribute and not to concentrate lands, which was what we had during the counterinsurgency period and the paramilitary period. 2, we need a capacity to enter the territories, not only with the redistribution of lands, but also with the delivery of infrastructure, public goods, services, generating the effective conditions to change this productive matrix and the commerce conditions, democratizing agriculture and livestock credit and the decision making. And this is reflecting about the land policy and management, which needs to be different. And I believe that in terms of obstacles that the government has tried to change, it's hard to change them. And many of our bureaucracies, which already have the chip of liberal planning, I believe that planning in the short term must show small results, and the state forgets that we believe this is an NGO that's not able to redistribute, but changing this in the DNA of the structure of the agrarian institution is complex.
And thirdly, I'd like to talk about the protection. We are very afraid to lose this, but it's important to have institutions such as ICARRD and the social forum and the academic conference that is taking place in February at the end of this month in the city of Cartagena. These are three very important events because we will try to increase the aligning so that we can make all this happen. The peasant and indigenous and Afro-descendant organizations, political parties, companies will have dialogue scenarios, and it's important to push to increase this aligning of strengths at those times.
Muchas gracias, Jenny.
Thank you so much,
Bueno,
Jenny.
vamos a
We will
abrir entonces
now
a preguntas y
open
comentarios
to questions
de
and
los
comments
demás
from the other
participantes. Voy a
participants.
ser necia y
I am
como
going to
abusar de mi
abuse my
posición
power
planteándolas unas preguntas.
and
Tengo
raise a
dos
few
como
questions. I have
preguntas
two
que son más como
questions
para las personas que
that
no
are
conocen
for
el contexto
those
colombiano,
or
que
for the
pues vale
benefit
la
of those
pena
that don't
como
understand the
aclarar
political
y
context in
destacar. Y
Colombia that
pues una
is worth
pregunta que es más
highlighting.
como
And then another
similar.
question that
La
is
pregunta
more
es,
personal. The
la
first
primera
question
es sobre
is,
Nuri de Fensuagro
Nuri
mencionó
from
las zonas de
Fensuagro
reserva campesina
mentioned the
y me parece
peasant
que podría
reserve
ser
areas, and I think it could be
útil de pronto
useful,
si
perhaps,
Nuri o bueno
if
o mi
Nuri
representante o
or
Jenny
Nuri from
quisiera
CCJ or
explique un
Jenny, for
poco
that
para
matter,
los que
could
no conocen
explain for
qué son
those
las
of
zonas de
us,
reserva
or for those of you who
campesina,
don't know what these
pues
reserve
como qué
areas
valor o
are,
importancia tienen para las
what
comunidades
importance they
campesinas
have
y
for the
inclusive como el
peasant
dato porque
communities.
me
And
sonó que en los otros
I
gobiernos solo
understand
pasaron
that
como
in
6
other
en todos esos
governments
años y pues
it
me
was
dejó
only
muy
about
el dato
6
de cuántos existen
that
ahora
were
o
enacted, but
cuántas
how
zonas de
many are there
reservas
now? I
campesinas han
missed
sido
that. How
aprobados
many of such
en
areas have
estos
been
últimos años.
approved over
Entonces
the
esa
last
sería
few
como la
years? So
primera,
that would be
como
my
para
first
que
question.
la audiencia pueda entender un
So
poquito
the
qué
audience
son
can
las zonas de reserva
understand,
campesina
better
y que de pronto
understand
eso no
what
figura
these
en el mapa específico de
reserves
Colombia.
are.
Otra pregunta
And the other
que
question,
también se refiere a
which
una que
also
mencionó Nuri de
refers
Fensuagro,
to something that Nuri from
mencionó, bueno, creo que
Fensuagro
Nuri de SJ
mentioned,
mencionó también la importancia del
and someone else mentioned, is
reconocimiento
the importance
del
to
campesinado como sujeto de
acknowledge peasants
protección especial.
as subjects
También
of
me
special
gustaría
protection.
si pueden
I
como
would like if
explicarnos
you
un
could
poco esto
explain a little
para
bit
los que no conocen el
this for
contexto,
those who don't
qué
understand the
implica.
concept
No sé
or don't
si
know the
quieren
concept, what it
explicar
means. I'm not
como
sure if you'd
validado
like
con
to
el
explain
Green
its
Drop
relationship with
y la declaración de los
other
derechos
elements and the
internacional de la
Declaration
ONU
of Rights
y
of
también como
Peasants
qué
at the
significa en la
UN and
práctica
what it means
em,
really
qué
on the
significa en la
ground.
práctica, digamos, ese protección
What
especial
do
dentro de
these
la
special
Constitución
protections
colombiana.
mean within the
Esas fueron
Colombian
las dos como
institution
que creo que pueden ser
constitution?
interesantes para los
I
que no
think we could
conocen el
start
contexto
off with
colombiano.
those two questions for
Y
those of you
entonces
who are not
el
familiar with the
tercero
Colombian
creo que
context.
puede
And the third
interesarnos a todos.
question perhaps is interesting
Yo
to
quisiera
all of
como
us.
Nuri de CCJ
Nuri from
mencionó
CCJ mentioned
como el tema de muchos ganaderos que fueron a
the
ofrecer la
cattle
venta nacional de
raisers that offered
tierras,
land,
como entendí que a vender tierras
as
a la
I
Agencia
understood,
Nacional
to
de Tierras que actualmente
sell
eran tierras
lands to
baldías.
the agency that
Y
were
pues
actually
no sé, yo
unused
tengo
lands,
como esa
were
pregunta, ¿qué fue lo que
uncultivated
ha pasado
lands.
con
And
eso?
I
Porque
don't
recuerdo que al
understand what
inicio
happened
del
there because
gobierno
I remember at the
hubo
beginning of the
como
government,
mucho, como
there was a
muchos
lot
gritos
of
y bulla
outroar,
porque Petro pues habló con
outrage because
la
Petro
FAUNI
spoke with the
y pues supuestamente
FAUNI
se iba
and
a ir
they
comprando
were
tierras
to
y bueno,
buy
hubo mucha
land
bulla alrededor de eso
supposedly, and there was a lot of
y como por otro lado
discussion
el tema
around that.
de
And then on the
recuperación de
other
baldíos.
hand,
Entonces quería
what
como
happened
preguntar por
with
esas cosas,
the
dos cosas.
recovery
Entendí
of
que
unused
Agri
land? So I wanted
creo
to
que Nuri de Fensuagro
understand
mencionó
I think
como un
Nuri from
bloqueo y
Fensuaga
la
mentioned
recuperación de
a
baldíos.
blockage of
Y
the
les
recovery
quería
of such lands, and I
preguntar
wanted
como,
to
¿qué ha
ask
pasado con este
what's
supuesto
happened
acuerdo
with this
con
supposed
los ganaderos de
agreement
tales tierras?
with
¿Qué ha
the
pasado con
cattle
eso? Y
raisers?
también de pronto
What
explicar
happened with
por
that
qué,
and
por qué se
why?
hizo como
Why
ese, en vez de, digamos, como
this
dice
happened
Jenny
instead of,
o
as
Nuri,
Jenny
como
said
utilizar
or
las
Nuri said,
herramientas,
to
sí, como
use
para que entendamos esa
tools
decisión.
to understand
Hablé
that
mucho,
this.
esas son
I
tres
spoke too
preguntas como
much.
para
These are my three
arrancar.
questions to start us off.
No sé si quieren
I'm not
como
sure
yo ir empezando con estas y
if
ahorita voy
you can
recogiendo
start with
entonces
these
de
and
los
then
demás
I
participantes.
others can ask questions as
No
well.
sé si alguien de las
Would
panelistas
anyone like to answer from the
no sé usted,
panelists?
¿quiere ir primero o quiere
Who
responder
wants to
alguna de
go
las tres?
first?
Bueno, pues teniendo en cuenta que lo señalabas
Bearing in
en
mind
relación con la
what you were
información que
saying
hice,
with
bueno, frente al tema del reconocimiento del
related
campesino
to my
como sujeto de
intervention,
protección, pues brevemente
I
contarles
would like to
que
briefly
en el
tell you that
2013
in
el Movimiento
2013,
Nacional Campesino pues, solicitó incluir el
the
reconocimiento
peasant
dentro de los
institution
censos, dentro de la forma de
requested to be
proyecto
included within the
censal
census, the population census,
como un factor
as
importante
an
de
important
determinación
factor
de la
to
población, ¿cierto?
determine
Digamos, un
or
poco la
to
consigna era para que el
establish the
campesino siempre
population.
debe ser contado, ¿sí? Y digamos
The
que
peasants
ahí
need to
empieza un
be,
poco la
of course,
pelea
counted. So that's when the
jurídica de
struggle,
competencia
the
en
legal
torno a
struggle
que
began,
se instaura una acción de tutela precisamente
because there is a
buscando
tutelage action
garantizar
to
que haya una
guarantee
casillas
that
donde la
there
gente
be a
pueda
place where people
libremente
could
autodeterminarse como población
freely
campesina en este
identify
censo.
as
Esto se
peasant
da, digamos,
population in this
también en el
census.
marco de la Declaración de
And
los
this
Derechos
takes
del
place
Campesinado que
within the
fue
framework of
aprobada
the Declaration
por
of
la Asamblea
Rights of
General de las Naciones Unidas,
Peasants at the UN
donde
Assembly,
se hace este reconocimiento precisamente a los derechos
where
de campesinos y
where the
campesinas,
recognition is given
precisamente que
to
trabajan
peasants and
en
those
las
who
zonas
work
rurales.
in the rural areas.
Y internamente
And
en el
internally,
año
in the year
2018, la Corte
2018,
Suprema de
the
Justicia
Supreme
le dijo a
Court of
Gustavo Petro que
Justice
debía
says
contar
to
con
the
el
Colombian
reconocimiento
government that they need to
legítimo de
have
la
effective
población
mechanisms to
campesina y en
identify
ese marco,
peasant
digamos
communities,
pues se establece
and
la necesidad de
that's when
identificar
they
cómo se
need
debe
to
contar con
establish
esas, digamos,
how
esas
to
dimensiones del
count and what
campesinado
are the
sobre lo que
dimensions as to
internamente
uh,
el Instituto
peasantship,
de
and
Antropología e Historia en Colombia determina, hace un
then
análisis
it's
de cuáles son las
determined an
dimensiones
analysis and
esa clase política
anthropological and
social
political
que
and
tiene el
economical
campesinado y cómo ir
and
trabajando
other
con autoridades
aspects are
legítimas para
included
definir
to define
el reconocimiento
these
a este
recognition
sujeto de especial protección,
of a
porque como te
special
compartí, es
subject of
una mirada
protection, because this
enfocada
requires a
que tenga
focused
en cuenta los
perspective
elementos
that
que un poco
bears in
mencionaba
mind
precisamente
all
la
the elements
territorialidad
I just
campesina, que
mentioned
también
and the
establece esa alianza que
territorial
tiene el
peasantry,
campesinado con la
where
tierra. Y
uh,
pues
there
como
is
bien
an
mencionaba también
establishment
actualmente
of this
ICARRD
special
censurado,
bond
también
between the
se da
peasant and the
económicamente
land.
un artículo de la
And
Constitución
this,
política, el
the
artículo
political
134,
constitution,
que se
Article
reconozca
60, is amended to
sin embargo,
acknowledge
hay que
peasants.
decirlo,
However, we have to say,
hago énfasis en esto porque en la
and I
realidad,
emphasize this because
con
in
las
actual
organizaciones campesinas
fact,
que
with
trabajamos desde la
the
Confederación
peasant
Colombiana de Sujetos,
organizations where we
sigue
work in
existiendo
my organization, there
el
still
reconocimiento al
is
sujeto de
this
especial protección fijado en
notion
la ley, pero
that
en la
to be
práctica no se da.
acknowledged is wonderful,
Entonces,
but in actual
el
fact,
implemento, pues digamos,
this is
más
not
que no haya
so.
pasado, por supuesto hay
So,
muchos avances,
of
como,
course,
como
there
lo
are many steps
mencionaba
forward. I don't
Jennifer,
want to
desde
generalize.
otros gobiernos,
As Jenny
pero
said,
pues
there
podemos
is a
decir que
step
las cosas
forward in
se
relation to
cumplen
other
desde el
governments,
punto
but
legal.
we should not say that
Se hace
everything
mucho
is
énfasis,
fulfilled.
el
So we
campesinado pues no
emphasize,
solamente basta y es muy importante ese
and it's
reconocimiento
important
jurídico y
to have this
político,
acknowledgement,
¿cierto?
but
Pero
it's
tiene
not enough.
trascendencia y
Of
tenemos que
course, it
tener,
transcends and it has
digamos,
weight
luchar por los derechos,
to fight
pero
for
hace
the
falta
rights.
la
But
implementación en cada una de
implementation
nuestras
is needed.
actividades políticas, los
Activities,
instrumentos
political
que el
plans,
Estado colombiano
instruments that the
desarrolló o
Colombian
pone en marcha
state
para
needs to
precisamente
develop or
garantizar
set into motion to
los derechos del
guarantee
campesinado.
the
Y
rights
yo
of
vuelvo, digamos, a
peasants.
referirme un poco a un
And
caso
I go
particular
back to
específico
referring
y
to
es
a specific
cómo
case, which is
digamos, la
how
disposición
For example, the disposition of resources when it comes to peasants in places such as that were awarded special protection, such a natural reserve, also have conflict because effectively we're talking about strategic areas for conservation that have a transcendence for the Colombian society and for humanity when it comes to conservation. Uh, but when the peasants live in these areas, they have not been acknowledged as part of it. Their figures as a collective or to inhabit those territories and to be in tune with nature have not been acknowledged or recognized. And so these individuals was decided needs to be taken out of these areas. We have a special case in Cordoba with the natural reserve there, where there is a peasant community that's been there since the 60s, and then in the year 75 in Bogota, the national reserve or national park element is instituted, but nothing is said about the peasant that lives there. So this territory is actually dealt with as an empty land, and it can belong to anyone except to the Colombian government for its importance for natural conservation. And the peasants that live in that territory later in the years in the 90s, at the end of the 90s, were victims of the armed conflict with many violations to their human rights. They had to actually leave the land, but they continue with that connection. And so we need to acknowledge this special protection subject as we discussed, that's mentioned in Article 64, that fulfills or develops the study of the analysis that ICANN carries out. It implies making decisions that have to do with the protection of peoples. And what we have is a community that is outside of their land, that goes to the national park because they have activities of cattle raising and agriculture there because it's their way of living, but they also have the conviction that one day they'll be able to go back because it is considered to be an unused or an empty land. But the decision at the time was taken, and we don't know what's going to happen. And this also has to do with restitution as a fundamental right. So the recognition of the peasant figure is really important, but we need to continue to work on this. And I think Jennifer has made an important call in the framework of the International Conference of Agrarian Reform to make this visible when it comes to acknowledging subjects so that there is precisely an equal redistribution of the land. Because if we don't recognize these subjects, of course, we won't be able to provide them with the equal distribution, because there is no understanding as to why that land is needed and for whom. And I would leave it at that.
Muchas gracias, Nuri. Y de nuevo, me parece muy
Many
interesante
thanks, Nuri, and I
escucharlo
think it's
como ya
important to
aterrizado a
hear
casos
how you
concretos
have lended
y
to
cómo
your
se están
subjects and
desenvolviendo
how they are
estos casos.
developing
Yo
these
sé que
cases.
todavía hay,
I know
bueno,
that
Nuri nos habló un poco de cómo
Nuri
se está
spoke a little bit about
implementando,
how
más
they're
bien no
implementing
respetando, no
and
implementando ese reconocimiento
this
del
recognition
campesinado
of
y
the
sus roles
peasantry
de protección
and their status
perdón,
of protection as a
¿cómo es?
subject. How
Sujetos
do you
a
say it?
protección especial, ahí.
Subject to special protection, yeah.
Y yo sé que les dejé
And
dos
I know
preguntas más
that
que las
I
relaciono
left two
Nuri
additional
recibe tres.
questions to
Campesinos
about
también sobre el tema que pasó con el
the
acuerdo con los
topic that
ganaderos y qué está
about the
pasando con la recolección
agreement
de
with
uvas. Así
the
que quédense
farmers
pendientes.
that raise
Pero
cattle. I know
quiero
these are
dejar, porque
huge
vi
topics,
que
but I'd like
alguien
to leave it this
más
way because I
quiero dejar
saw
un espacio.
that
Voy a
I want
abrir
to leave some
a tres
room,
preguntas más
and we
y
will
luego no sé
proceed to
si
three
Jenny
additional
y Nuria
questions. And I don't know if
pueden elegir
Jeannie,
como
Nuri
en cuál van
can perhaps
respondiendo.
decide how we will
Entonces,
be
no sé si
answering
Vicent
these questions.
Garcés
So,
quiere como
Vicent,
hablar, tiene el
Vicent
micrófono, abrir su
Garces,
micrófono
if you'd
y
like
hacer
to
su
speak, please
pregunta.
open your microphone and ask your question.
Vicente,
Vicent?
no sé, Vicente.
Vicente, tal vez? Oh, perhaps.
No, no sé, no me escucha de pronto.
I
Y
can't
también
hear
hay
you,
otra
ahora?
Vicent.
¿Me escucháis?
What about now? Can you hear
sí,
me?
ahora sí. Sí,
Sí.
sí.
Yes, now we
Si quiere,
hear you.
adelante para hacer su pregunta.
Please ask
Sí,
your
digo,
question.
agradecer las intervenciones
I'd like to thank you
de
for
las tres
the
ponentes y
intervention of the
de Laura,
three speakers and the
muy útiles
moderator.
para conocer la
These have
situación
been
actual
really
y el contexto.
useful for getting to learn about the current
Y
situation and
hacerle
context.
una pregunta
And I'd like to ask
muy
you a
concreta
question,
sobre
concretely, in concrete terms,
la reforma agraria que se
about
está
the
desarrollando
agrarian
en
reform
Colombia
that's
desde
being
unos años
developed in Colombia in
durante la
recent
Petro
years, and during the
y
Petro
el
years,
factor
and
redistribución de la
the
tierra.
factor of land
Me gustaría saber
redistribution. I'd like
cuántos
to
millones
know
de
how
hectáreas
many million hectares
se han expropiado en
have
estos
been
años,
expropriated
o
over
cuántos
these
millones
years,
y cuántos
or
millones de
how many
hectáreas
million hectares
se han podido conseguir
were able to
de,
have been assigned
de
to
recuperación,
for
de
recovery,
recuperación de la
for the
corrupción,
recovery regarding the
del
issue of
narcotráfico, y
drug
cuántos
dealing,
millones de hectáreas
and how
se
many
han
million hectares
distribuido
have been
a
distributed
los
effectively
campesinos en
to
Colombia
the
en
peasantry
estos
in
años.
Colombia
Mi
in the
referencia
recent
es la
years.
histórica de
My
Chile,
reference
en
is
el
the
periodo
history
de
of
Allende
Chile. In
se
the Allende
expropiaron 6
years,
millones de hectáreas en total.
6 million hectares have been
En el
expropriated.
periodo de Frey,
And in
en
the
3 años,
Frede,
se
in
expropiaron
3 years,
3 millones de hectáreas
3 million
que fueron
hectares,
asignadas
which have been allocated
conforme a
or
los criterios
allotted
de redistribución de la
according
tierra
to the
a los
criteria of land
campesinos en estos
redistribution
territorios.
to
Mi
local
pregunta es
peasantries
ahora,
and communities.
en los,
So
al periodo de Petro, ¿cuántos
in the
millones de
Petro
hectáreas
years,
se
how
han
many
podido expropiar?
hectares? Do you have this figure?
Gracias, Vicente.
Thank you, Vincent.
Y voy a
Well,
agregar una pregunta más y ya
I'd like
después
to
voy a ir con
add
más
another
preguntas.
question and then we'll
Entonces,
continue with the
Clara
answers.
Caballero quiere
Clara Caballero,
leer
would
o
you
hablar
like
su pregunta que
to
está en el
read
chat.
or
¿Te parece?
your question that's in the chat
Se
box?
me ha desconfigurado. La pregunta la he
Um,
mandado escrita,
the
no la he
question,
recibido.
I
Y
sent
se me ha
it in written
desconfigurado
and
la
I can't
pantalla.
see it anymore
Os
in my
veo
screen.
vosotros, pero no
I
veo.
can see you,
¿La
but I
podéis
don't
leer?
see the
La
question
pregunta,
anymore.
¿la puede leer? Porque creo que la...
Can somebody read it for
Claro
me?
que sí, claro que sí, no hay
Yes, I
problema.
can read it, no problem.
Siempre si no quieren hablar, no
If
hay
you
problema,
don't
estamos
want to
para
No es
leerlo.
speak,
una
there's not a
palabra, es que se
problem.
me ha
It's not that I don't want to
desconfigurado la
speak, but I
pantalla.
lost the configurations of the screen and I can't
Entiendo,
find
entiendo,
the question
gracias. Bueno,
anymore. I understand
quiere
it. She wrote,
primero dar las gracias
first
a
of
todos los
all, thank
ponentes.
you to all speakers.
Y entonces ella
And
dice que la pregunta va
the
dirigida a todos
question
los
is
ponentes,
aimed at all
considerando que el
speakers,
origen y
considering
problemas
that
de
the origin
distribución de la
of
tierra están
land
relacionados con la
restitution
colonización.
projects are related
En
to
el marco del segundo
colonization.
diseño
In the
de
second
descendencia, es
design
posible
of
reformular una
Afro-descendancy, is it possible to
integral de las
formulate
políticas redistributivas de acceso a la tierra
redistributive
de las
policies of
comunidades
access
rurales
to land
indígenas
to
y
the rural, indigenous,
afrodescendientes
and
en la
African
misma demanda?
Afro-descendant
Entonces, no sé
community under
si
the same
entiendo bien que
demand?
tiene que ver
I don't know
con
if I
no sé,
understood it
relación
well, but it's
entre,
got to do with
digamos,
the
grupos
relationships
afrodescendientes
between
y grupos indígenas y
African
grupos
descending
campesinos
groups,
en ese
indigenous
pago
and
sobre la
peasant
tierra. No
groups,
sé
and
si
redistribution
entendí
policies,
bien o
right?
quiere
I don't know
agregar
if I
algo, Clara.
understood it well.
Sí,
Would you like to
correcto.
add
Estamos en
anything,
el marco
Clara?
del segundo
Yes,
diseño
because
de
we're
la
in the second design
afrodescendencia
of
y
the
formular una demanda
Afro-descendants,
que se puede
and I'd
hacer en
like
Colombia,
formulate a
formulado
demand
una
in
demanda
Colombia
en que esa demanda
in which
incluye a las
this demand
comunidades rurales,
includes
pero no
the
solo a
rural
las
communities,
indígenas de
but
afrodescendientes, porque
doesn't
el origen y la
separate
problemática
indigenous
de la
from
tierra
African descendants
que
because the
vosotros tenéis
origins of
como
the
la
land
experiencia en todos
issues,
los países,
as we have had
ha
in the
sido la
country,
colonización
has been
y como
colonization
hay
itself.
esta
And
carrera en el
in
segundo
this
diseño de la
second
afrodescendencia
design
va a
regarding
pensar un
African
poco más
descending,
aprovechar
we will have a little bit
y
more of
formular una
advancement and
demanda con
formulate
respecto
a
del acceso a
demand,
la
a
tierra,
joint
pero
demand
para las
of access
comunidades
to land,
rurales sin
but for the
separar
rural
a
communities
indígenas de
and
afrodescendientes,
distinguishing
sin
between
separar a las
indigenous and
comunidades
Afro
rurales.
descendants and rural communities.
¿Es
Bueno,
posible?
gracias.
Is it possible?
Gracias, Clara, por la pregunta.
Thank you, Clara,
No
for
sé
your
si
question.
Jenny
I don't
o
know,
Nuri
Jenny,
o
Nuri,
Consuagro, ¿quién quiere hablar?
Fensuagru, who wants
Y
to
ya
answer
recojo
these
más preguntas,
questions?
que veo
And I'll
muchísimas.
collect
Gracias.
additional questions further on, okay?
Bueno, yo comienzo, Jennifer, si
I'll
quieres,
begin,
y tú
Jennifer,
haces lo más profundo, digamos,
and
de
you can
la
perhaps dig
reflexión.
it deeper
Yo quiero hablar
later,
más que todo sobre
further on. I'd like to
funciones
speak,
como
first of
movimiento
all,
campesino,
about
¿no?
what I considered as a
Con este
peasant
tema de la zona de
movement
reserva campesina,
regarding the
y que
peasant
nosotros, o como decía
reserves
yo al
or
inicio,
protected
siempre la figura
areas for
territorial que está
peasants. It's
reconocida en
a
la ley 160
territorial figure that was
y
recognized
que
in
los gobiernos anteriores no
1960,
tuvieron en cuenta,
and
que se
the
llama
previous
espacio territorial, que puede
power
ser
holders did not recognize it as a
en el
territorial
administrativo, ir más
spaces.
allá de un
In the
municipio, puede ser más de un
administrative
municipio,
actions in the
más de un
municipalities,
departamento.
it can perhaps
Y
belong to more than one
en donde
municipality or
existe el
department at
reconocimiento de esta
cases,
zona de
and
reserva
the place
campesina,
that
donde
needs
hay uno,
recognition is a
plan
zone of
de desarrollo
peasant reserve.
sostenible
One, we need sustainable development
comunitario
and
que se dé de
community
manera colectiva,
development, collectively
teniendo en cuenta
built,
los temas
bearing in mind the
ambientales, de
productive
relacionamiento
environmental issues
cultural,
of
de
relationships,
posicionamiento
cultural relationships,
político,
of
de
political
conservación de
positions,
la biodiversidad
conservation of
y la
biodiversity,
comercialización,
and
es un
commercialization.
territorio de vida.
It is a living
Y
territory
la
or
ley
a life
permite que
territory.
donde hay
And the law
territorios
allows
reconocidos de
these
zonas de reserva campesina,
territories
no
that are
debe
recognized as peasant
haber
reserves
acaparamiento, no debe haber
uh,
latifundio.
are not
No
subject
debe
to
haber
land grabbing
explotación
or
de
to
recursos,
large
minerales,
properties or
de
exploitation
extractivismo.
of
Entonces,
extractivism
es una
of
figura
natural
que
resources, mineral
ayuda a
resources.
proteger
So
el
it's a legal
territorio,
figure
que ayuda
that
en la
helps
relación
protecting the
entre
territory
comunidades
and helps in the
que se hayan.
relationships between the communities
De
living
todas
there.
maneras, eso sí va entrelazado,
It's
digamos, con el reconocimiento del campesinado que
regarding the
participó
recognition of
en
the
una PPC
peasantry,
junta,
as was
del
explained
proceso que se ha dado,
before, in the
pero
process that we had in
nosotros
SSJ,
siempre utilizamos,
and
el movimiento
we
campesino en
always
Colombia
use
siempre
the
utilizó
peasant
la
movement in
Carta
Colombia,
Modelo
always
de la
uses
Declaración como
the
una
charter of the
herramienta en sus planes de
declaration as
trabajo
a
desde hace mucho
tool
tiempo.
in
Yo creo
its
que Colombia ha
working
sido
plans. I
el país
believe
donde el
Colombia has
movimiento
been the
campesino
country
más ha
where
avanzado
the
la carrera
peasant
antes de que fuera
movement has
en el
advanced the
2018
most.
reconocida
Before
por
2018,
las Naciones
their rights
Unidas,
were
por la ONU.
recognized by the United
Pero
Nations.
desafortunadamente el
But
gobierno colombiano,
unfortunately,
por supuesto,
the Colombian
afortunadamente reconoce
government,
la
the Colombian
declaración, pero
government
no es
recognized the
vinculante con
declaration, but it's
la
not
Constitución.
binding
Y eso
with the
significa que otro gobierno
Constitution.
puede venir
And
acá y
this means
simplemente
that
no la
another
reconozca,
government can
pero que con
simply
base en
show
ello
up
se
and
hizo
does
y se
not
elaboró la
comply
ley
with it.
01 y eso
And
no es
then we
vinculante.
have the
En
Legislative
Colombia
Act
se vincula.
01, which is really
Y,
important.
y, y que se
Um,
habla también
and
de la importancia
we
de la
also
parte
speak about the
institucional.
importance
Colombia
of the
lleva más de
institutional
30
aspect.
años
Colombia, for
con esta
30 years now,
constitución
has
donde no se
been with
reconoce
this
al
constitution,
campesinado, no se
which does
reconoce su
not
figura, no se reconoce.
recognize the
Y
peasants
entonces
and their
hoy la
figures.
institucionalidad
So
toda está
nowadays, the
hecha para
institutional
no
aspects
reconocer al
are
campesinado, está
established
hecha en contra
not
del
to
campesinado.
recognize and
Toda la
are against
normatividad
the
de este país
peasant.
está hecha
All
en
the
contra
rules
del
of this
campesinado.
country
Entonces tiene que
go
hacer todo un
against the
ajuste y
peasantry.
una
So we
ley
need a whole
integralmente
full-fledged
articulada de tal
adjustment,
manera que
including the
haya
articles
una
of these
armonización de la
laws, so that they
institucionalidad.
can
En la
harmonize the
comisión mixta
institutional
nosotros estamos
aspects.
trabajando en
And in the
reforma de
mixed
políticas
commission, we're
públicas y
working with
ajuste
public
institucional.
policies
Estamos
and
trabajando con el
institutional
Instituto de la
adjustments and
Planeación y estamos haciendo
equality
propuestas desde
planning.
allí porque
And we
hay
are
que mirar
submitting
que el
proposals
Instituto de Antropología
because
también
with the
trabajó, se hizo meses con
Anthropologia
el campesinado,
Institute,
con
we
los
have been
territoriales.
working
La
for
gobierna
months
nos
with the
obligó a que se
peasantry,
creara la licencia,
uh, trying
se
to
creara
obtain
la
the
conceptualización del
property and
campesinado
the
y no se
concepts of
aportamos
a
allí. Y para
peasantry,
finalizar,
which is
decir
really
que
important. And to conclude, I'd like to say that
dentro de los otros reconocimientos de figuras
regarding the
territoriales,
other
que los voy a
recognitions
separar
of
los indígenas,
territorial figures, such
los
as
consejos comunitarios
indigenous
para las
reserves,
comunidades indígenas,
community councils
otras
for
figuras para el
communities, local
campesinado que no le
communities, and
explican que son los
additional
territorios
figures.
agroalimentarios.
So the
Como no hay
food
reconocimiento del
territories
campesinado,
and the
a veces los
recognition of the
derechos se
peasantry.
traslapan
Sometimes
en
the
los territorios y tenemos
rights
problemas, ¿sí?
are
Porque
crossed in the
dentro del
territories
acto
because
legislativo
within
01
the
de reconocimiento del
Legislative Act
campesinado
01,
no hay
recognition of
consulta previa, no se
peasantry, there's
reconoce
no
la consulta
previous
previa para el
consultation.
campesinado,
It's not
pero
recognized the
para las
prior
comunidades
consultation
étnicas
for the
sí.
communities.
Entonces ahí
It's
está
recognized for ethnic
un,
communities, but not for peasants. For the ethnic
va a haber
communities,
mayor
there will
diálogo entre las
be
comunidades, pero eso sí es
increased
responsabilidad del
dialogue among the
Estado.
communities, but it's an
Hay
instance of
suficiente
the
tierra en
state,
Colombia para que
and
todos
there's enough land in
los
Colombia
conocemos
so
rurales
that
y
all rural
desembolsemos en el
populations
territorio. Y
can
frente
be in the
a
territories.
lo
And
afrodescendiente
considering
en
the
Colombia
African descendants in Colombia, they're recognized,
las comunidades negras.
the
Y
Afro
las comunidades
communities are
negras
recognized,
se
and
reconocen en un
Black
territorio
communities are
como
recognized in the
consejos
territories
comunitarios.
as
Y
community
por supuesto,
councils.
los indígenas
And
también
of
tienen un
course, the indigenous
reconocimiento
peoples also count on the
y tienen,
recognition,
ellos sí tienen
and they
muchos
do have many decrees regulating their status, and they have a lot of autonomy in their territories. They have all types of institutions, and which we as peasants so far are only beginning this path. But this is it, basically. And for instance, in the case of the peasants who the aspect of the conceptual issues and the cultural aspects of access to the land and the ways of producing food for the society. And in our peasant movement, we're identified as peasants. We also see indigenous peoples identified as such. They self-identify themselves as well as African descending or blacks, and they're part of the communities, of the black communities. So we've been working with this, and now we're working with the 10-year plan that will be presented to the conference, which is a construction that we have built since February 2025 as the second Pact of Chicoral, which is favorable to the peasantry, where we're building a scenario, a 10-year plan, because this problem that we have in Colombia cannot be solved in one single administration. We need more time, and we're working together between the peasantry, indigenous peoples, and African communities. So our dialogues, we're holding these dialogues together with the government, which has been supporting these dialogues and processes. Let's hope that we can make headway and things can be extended, and this political project can continue and allow us to
Muchas
advance even
gracias,
more.
Nuri.
Many thanks, Nuri.
Como de pronto para después, cosa que
So
me parece de pronto
something
interesante comentar
that
es
seems
cómo
too
ha sido
interesting to
para,
comment on and
usted
is
mencionó
how
mucho,
it has been. You
está
have
trabajando
mentioned a
Defenso
lot
Agro, que
that
es
you're
pues,
working with
la más
Defenso
grande, una de las
Agro,
más
which is the
grandes
largest or one of
sindicatos
the
agrarios del
largest
país.
agrarian
Bueno,
unions of the
valdría
country
como
with the
hacer, la
government.
pena hacer esa pregunta
So
de la
this question that we
diferencia
have about the difference
de
in
la
terms
comunicación
of
y el
communications
trato entre gobierno y
and
Defenso Agro
with the
en este
government
gobierno
and
comparado
Defenso
al
Agro, which
pasado.
in this
Me parece muy
vis-a-vis the
interesante
past,
escuchar qué
it
tanto
seems
están
to, I
trabajando
think,
con
believe it's
Defenso Agro, con
important to
otras
hear how
organizaciones
much
de
you have been
relación
working with
del
these
gobierno. Bueno, voy a
grassroots
pasar a Jenny Aguilar,
organizations and so on.
luego
I'll
voy
pass the
a
floor to
recoger
Jenny, and
varias
then I will
preguntas porque sí
soon
veo
collect
varias
new
manos
questions because I
alzadas.
do see
Entonces,
many hands
Jenny,
raised.
te doy la
So,
palabra y luego
Jenny,
recogemos ya más
you have the
preguntas.
floor, and soon we will return
Trato
to
de
the
ser
questions.
breve. La pregunta que
I
hizo
believe
Vicente va
the question
directo a la
that
yugular.
about this
Y
topic
es,
went
bueno,
directly
una
to the
reforma
neck,
agraria y
the
expropiación.
agrarian
¿Cuántas
reform and
hectáreas ha expropiado el
expropriation. How
gobierno?
many hectares
Esa
has the
cifra no la
government
conozco, pero hay que hacer un
expropriated?
poquito de
I don't know
contexto,
these
gente. Y es
figures,
que en la
but
campaña
we need to know
electoral,
about the context
cuando
and the
Gustavo Petro
electoral
era el
campaign when
candidato,
Gustavo
él fue a una
Petro was a
notaría
candidate.
y en notaría dijo que no
I
iba a
went to
expropiar.
the notary's
Es
office
una
and
cuestión un
they
poco
said it
sin
couldn't be
sentido desde mi
expropriated. It
punto de
was a
vista,
senseless thing from my
porque la
standpoint
expropiación es una
because
figura
expropriation
jurídica
is a
que
legal
usan
figure
los
that
estados
the
para
states use
acceder a la tierra
to
que tiene una
have
función
access to land
social o
with a
pública.
social function or public
Estados
function.
Unidos, por
The
ejemplo,
United States,
es
for
uno
instance, is
de los
one
estados
of
que más
the
utiliza la
countries that
expropiación.
uses land
Y hace poquito
expropriations the
revisé un
most.
artículo, lo hablaba
And
con Frances hace
I
poco
believe I was
tiempo,
speaking with Francis
y
some
un
while
estado no
ago.
renuncia a la
And
expropiación
a
porque
state does not
y un
renounce
gobierno no renuncia a la
expropriation, and
expropiación porque es
government
un
won't do it
mecanismo
because it's a
fundamental para
fundamental
poder generar
mechanism
procesos
for
que conllevan una
generating
función de
processes
utilidad
that
pública.
comply with a public utility
Ahora hay que
function.
hacer también un poquito de contexto.
Now, we need
En
to bear in mind
Colombia,
the context. In
la primera ley de
Colombia,
reforma
the
agraria
first
es la Ley
agrarian
200 de
reform law
1936.
200 of
Otros manejan la Ley
1936, others say
135 de
law
1961.
135 of
Luego hubo
61.
reformas, la
And
Ley
then there were
1 del
reforms, the
68, en
first
el
law of
88 también hubo
68, and
otra, y
then
en el 94
88,
fue
and
la
then
260,
94
que
is
es la
the
famosa
law
original
160, which is the
en términos de reforma agraria. Y
currently
estas
in
leyes,
force in
con sus
terms of agrarian
cambios,
reform.
han habido unos
And these
mecanismos
laws and
para
their
que el Estado
changes, they
adquiera
established
tierras y la
mechanisms so that the
redistribuya. La
state can
expropiación
acquire
no es
and
el único
redistribute
mecanismo.
laws. And the
Está la extinción
expropriation
de
is not the
dominio
only
por tierras
mechanism. We have
confiscadas al
extinction of
narcotráfico, por ejemplo, a
dominium
la mafia,
from lands
pero también está la
confiscated from the
extinción de
drug
dominio
dealers and
porque las
mafias,
tierras no
as well
cumplen la
as
función
because the
social y
lands do not
económica de la
comply
propiedad.
with
O
the
sea, tierras
social and ecological
inmediatamente
functions of their
utilizadas,
properties. They were
inmediatamente
unduly
comercialmente explotadas.
used and exploited. We also have the special agrarian processes, which is an umbrella under which there are many mechanisms that the state should have been using, and it has done in this government, in this administration, recovering some properties that have been, we have many types of lands, and we have some complex places.
It's quite broad. There are unused areas. So all of these complexes, aquatic areas are sometimes flooded, sometimes are not, and this generates relationships with fishermen and with peasants of varied, that are quite varied. And so this kind of clogged these channels to either take over land, so the fishermen cannot fish, or it needs therefore used for extensive cattle raising. So this is a mechanism that allows to identify public lands and to clarify these properties, these lands. These mechanisms are used by the state to recover land and redistribute them. Concretely, how many lands has the Petro government awarded? According to the Agriculture Ministry, and you can search this on their website, approximately 286,000. How many have gone into the fund? More than 700,000. This is the land fund. How many have been formalized? And for Colombia, it's really important. For other countries with a current registration, perhaps not so much, but we require a double process for titling the title, but also to make that title official at the registration office. And many peasants and rural people have not actually, for many reasons, completed the process. So there's a huge informality to this process. And they've informed more than 1,900,000 hectares, and this is significant, as I said before. Before I close, I'd like to also mention, and I think Nuri has touched on this, that we have these mechanisms to acquire land and redistribute it, but also there is a process of dispossession that is quite strong, and we have numbers. We're talking about the paramilitary groups, displacement or dispossession, and other armed forces, and this is known as a country agrarian reform, counter reform, for more than 8 million hectares. So we need to compare the history, 40 years, since the law 165 of 1971. This is the law 135, up to the year 2000. In those 40 years of agrarian reform, we have good information on this. There were titles, or indigenous land was titled for more than 33,000 hectares. And this is a lot. I apologize, I got a call. This is a huge number of lands. And that's why at some point, former President Vélez said, no, the landowners in this country are the indigenous population. Of course, he was wrong, because many of these territories that today are under indigenous reserves are territories with the aim of conservation. And the same happens with the Pacific cordon or corridor that has also been object of distribution for Afro-descendant communities. In those 40 years, there were 1,800,000 hectares being redistributed. So in 40 years, we had 1.8 million lands being distributed. And the dispossession was 8 million hectares. So you need to compare these two facts. Today, the challenge has been to recover those dispossessed lands and award them through a process that's called land restitution. This is from a law from 2011. So this law included also the restitution of lands and the reparation to the community. So we have a process to recover these lands that were dispossessed and give them back to the peasants that, and of course there are limitations, but also many step forward. And we have a process of reconfiguring the law to transform the legal instruments we have today to, as you say, Vicente, make the agrarian reform real and concrete. It needs to generate two things, otherwise it's not an agrarian reform. It needs to change the agrarian structure and take away from those who have to give to those who don't have. And expropriation is, of course, a valuable tool for that, and that's why you asked that question. I think that expropriation needs to be used, and in a fast manner, in a speedy manner, for the Afro-descending indigenous and fishermen and peasant communities, and it also needs to decrease the inequality. Otherwise, we have not achieved agrarian reform. I'm sorry to have taken so long.
No, muchas gracias, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Jenny.
Un comentario rápido.
Just a quick comment. I did think it was interesting as I was reading over the last couple of days what is dominion extension in Colombia for undue use of lands in other countries is called expropriation. So of course there is a legal distinction in Colombia because there is no compensation. It's a different process. But I thought it was interesting that in other countries the same process could be called expropriation, and sometimes they're forced to compensate for it.
No quiero como extender
But I don't want
demasiado
to
a
take
recoger
too
una pregunta
long.
del
Let me
chat
pick up
y luego
one
voy a ir
question from the
con las
chat
personas que tienen
and
las
then go
manos
back to those
alzadas.
that
Para
have
no
their
ir
hands
olvidando el chat.
raised.
Bueno, miro aquí. Bueno, Martín nos ayudó mucho
Martin has really
explicando qué es la
helped
SAR,
us
qué
by
hace la SAR.
explaining what SAI does
Davinson
and what it
dice,
is. Davinson
es
says,
correcto, adecuado,
that's
realista pensar en
right.
acompañar la implementación
To
de la
think
reforma rural
about a
integral de
follow-up
procesos de
to the rural integral
agroindustrialización de
process of
origen cooperativo campesino
agro-industrialization
asociada a
of a
cultivos
cooperative
específicos como el cacao o el café,
system associated
reconocidos
with
en Colombia
coffee and
como
cocoa
cultivos
that are
básicos de los
acknowledged in
pequeños
Colombia
productores
as
y como motores
staple
económicos
crops
actuales del
and
campo colombiano. En resumen, es
financial
realista
motors.
pensar que la
So it
inserción
is
del pequeño
realistic to think that
campesino
the insertion of the small
organizado en la
peasant, the
industria de
small
alimentos le
producer
puede
that is
ayudar a
organized in the
restablecer y
food industry can
construir
help him
derechos
build and establish
repartidos.
rights and capabilities.
Y voy a ir con los demás preguntas
And
y
let me
comentarios
move
del chat
on
en
to
otra
other
ronda. Espero que nos
comments
alcance una
later.
ronda más, pero
Now,
quisiera como dar la
I'd
palabra a las
like
personas que están esperando
to give the
mucha
floor to
paciencia.
those that have been
Discúlpanme que
patiently
no sé el
waiting. I
orden en que
apologize.
alzaron
I'm
las
not
manos,
sure about
entonces
the
voy a ir
order in
como
which you raised
simplemente
your hands.
como tiene mi pantalla.
So
Entonces,
let me
Sofía,
do it as it
si quiere hacer su
appears on
pregunta
my
o
screen.
comentario,
Sophia, would you
adelante,
like
por
to
favor.
ask your question or make your comment?
Yo soy esa Sofía.
Am I that, Sophia?
Sofía, sí, por
Yes,
favor,
Sophia,
adelante.
please.
Vale,
Okay.
muchas gracias. Bueno, me ha parecido súper
I
interesante
thought it
todo
was really
lo que hemos
interesting,
discutido
everything that we have
durante
been
este rato.
discussing over
Y
the
yo
last
tengo una
couple of
gran
hours,
afinidad
and I have a great affinity
epistemológica y sobre
from
todo
an
emocional con el
epistemological
tema de la
point of
tierra,
view and also
por lo que
emotionally
implica
with
históricamente en este
the
país.
land
Pero una
for
cosa
its
que me ha hecho
implications
desde
in
hace
this
muchos días
country.
un ronron en la cabeza y que quiero exponérselo
I would
a
like
las
to
panelistas
ask a
para que
difficult
me puedan
question to the
orientar,
panelists so that they
porque
can perhaps
digamos que
guide
el
me
asunto
through
de la
this,
reforma
because the
agraria,
issue of the
claro
agrarian
que está
reform,
totalmente relacionado
of course, is
con
completely
la justicia
related
social, con la
with
paz
the
territorial, con
public,
la soberanía y
with
sobre todo con una
social
carga de
justice,
herencia
with
histórica muy,
sovereignty,
muy
and
alta.
with quite a historical
Pero también
load.
hay una realidad
But there's
del otro
also a
lado,
reality
que es
on the other side. which is how the country has been developing and where it's going, where's the youth going now, how agrarian is the country nowadays, despite us having a huge extension of land. Who produces, who works the land, what does it mean? So we are aware that the rural areas in Colombia are not technical as such. It's quite anachronic, the way in which food is produced in this country. And this has important social loads to what it means to work the land. This has to do with global customs, through globalization, over the interests of those who work the land. My question is about the redistribution process. We have just historical debts that are essential for the construction of the peace and social justice. But then the youth nowadays who want to study and don't go back to the lands from which they came, to those that are aging and don't have the ability to learn new techniques, how will they work the land? So this is something that troubles me, makes me wonder a lot, because it is really difficult to think about a total peace that does not imply redistribution of land. I don't think that's possible even. But then what are the ramifications for the future? Who will be in charge of
Gracias,
that
Sofía.
work?
Muy
Thank you
buena
so much,
pregunta.
Sophia. That's a
Los
great
jóvenes del
question.
campo que
On the
quieren
youth of
¿quién va
the
a
rural
trabajar esta
youth, what
tierra a
do they
futuro? Bueno,
want? Who is
¿cómo va a
going
ser
to
ese trabajo?
work this
Gracias,
land in
Sofía.
the future? Who will do
El
this
que sigue en mi
job?
pantalla
Thank you.
es Jason.
Next on my
Si
screen is
pueden como
Jason.
concretar
If
los
you could
comentarios y preguntas
please
para que
keep
nos
your
alcance como la
questions
otra ronda, ¿cierto? Por favor,
short so that
Jason,
we have
adelante.
enough time for everyone.
Buenos
Jason.
días, pues.
Good
Pues mi
morning.
pregunta está como
My
más enfocada,
question
digamos, en
is
esa
more
restitución o
focused
distribución de la tierra,
with the
pues teniendo también esa
redistribution
realidad
of
social de la
land.
zona rural, de
It's a social
abandono, de pobreza,
reality, there's
pues
abandonment,
también de
there's
falta de
poverty in
oportunidades.
rural
También quería
areas, there's
preguntar
also lack
si,
of
o sea,
opportunities.
si
I
una mayor
wanted to
presencia
ask
estatal, creación de
if
oportunidades,
there's
programas
creation of
especiales,
opportunities and special
construcción de vías de
programs
comunicación,
and
programas de
new
innovación,
ways of
ciencia,
communication,
tecnología, pues
innovation,
podría ayudar
science,
también,
technology
digamos,
programs.
también
Perhaps
en
all
esa
of this could
restitución hacerla
help
también como con justicia social, o sea, de una forma que
together
también
with
ayude al
social
campesino a tener
justice
herramientas
to help
para
the peasants have
poder, digamos, poder
tools
también,
to be able
digamos,
to
tener como también ese control también de, digamos,
have a
de esa
control
parcela, o sea, también de una
over their
forma, o sea, que le
plots
garantice también su propio sustento
and
y su
that
propio
they
bienestar.
can guarantee their own well-being and their own production.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Jason.
Thank you so much,
Y seguimos
Jason.
con Michelle
Now
Merlet,
Michelle
luego
Merlet, and
respuestas y
then
volvemos a hacer otra ronda
answers,
si
and we'll go
alcanzamos.
back
Michelle, por favor.
to the questions if there's enough time. Michelle.
Tiene el micrófono apagado, Michelle.
Your microphone is off.
Ahora sí.
Okay.
Buenas
Good
tardes a todos.
afternoon,
Gracias por todas
everyone.
estas
Thank you for the
explicaciones. La verdad es que
explanations.
resulta muy
The
difícil
truth
para
is that
alguien que
it's
no
quite
conoce
hard for
Colombia de
someone
entender
who
todo lo que
doesn't know
dicen.
Colombia to understand everything you're
Pero solo he
saying.
pasado como 10 días en
But
Colombia, así que en mis 50 años de
in
trabajo
over
sobre el
my
tema de la
50 years
reforma
of
agraria,
work on
yo
agrarian
sé que lo que
reform,
voy a hacer son
I
algunas observaciones
understand
muy
a
gruesas, ¿no?
little
Que me
bit, but I
parecen
have
cosas que
some
de las cuales no habla
sort of
y
more
que además
vague
necesitaría ser
observations,
ampliada mucho. La
and
primera
they
es
would
que
need to be brought in. The
hablan
first
con
one
mucho
is
desprecio
that
del
you
campesinado, de los
speak
campesinos, no ustedes, sino la gente aparentemente en Colombia.
with a
Y si hay una cosa
negative
que no dicen es que
sense
para qué
about
sirven
the
los
peasants. They
campesinos.
don't talk
¿Ah?
about
Yo creo
what
que
the
una de las
peasants are
cosas
for.
importantes
And I
que
think
hemos
one of
hecho
the
en los
useful
trabajos de
things
acta
we've done at
es de poner
ACTE
adelante
is
la
to
importancia económica
place
del
the
campesinado, que
importance,
los
the
campesinos
financial importance
producen
of the peasants. The
siempre, en
peasants
todo el año,
introduce always,
muchísimo
everywhere,
más valor
a
agregado,
lot
riqueza
more
agregada
added
de
value, and
unidades de superficie por hectárea que los
new richness
grandes
per
empresarios,
hectare than
que
the
los
great
latifundistas o que los grandes
entrepreneurs
empresarios
or
tecnificados. Eso es
landowners
la
or
primera cosa
technified
que yo
entrepreneurs.
creo que valdría la
That's
pena
first, and I
incorporarlo
think
en
it'd
su
be worth
discurso.
to
La
include this
segunda es que
into your
hablan de
speeches. The second is that
propietarios,
you talk
hablan de
about landowners, you
expropiar, que es
talk
quitar la
about
propiedad, ¿verdad?
expropriation,
Pero hablan, no
but
dicen de
you
propiedad
don't
de qué.
say
¿Y
which
qué es la
property
propiedad?
and
¿Qué
what
es la
is
propiedad del suelo?
property.
Esta es otra cosa que
What
es
is that? This
extremadamente
is something
importante,
else that
mucho más
is really
compleja
important
que
and
lo
much more
que están
complex than
diciendo.
what
Los
you're alluding
conceptos
to.
que usan no corresponden a la riqueza de los
So the
expedientes que
concepts that you
evocan, ¿no?
use are not
Esto del
corresponding
la
to the
reconocimiento de los
experiences
territorios y
and the
todo eso.
recognition of
Eso
territories in
si no se
their
tiene un concepto
all.
claro de lo
If
que
you
es
don't have a
propiedad y
clear
propiedad de qué,
concept of what
uno no
property
puede
is and what
reconocer que
for,
en realidad en
one
el
could
mismo,
not
en el mismo
recognize that the
territorio hay
reality in the same
diferentes
territory, there are
tenedores de
different
derecho, que pueden ser
holders of
personas, pueden
rights
ser
that can
familias,
be
pueden ser
individuals,
comunidades, pueden
families,
ser cooperativas,
communities,
pueden ser entes
cooperative
Estado,
groups,
¿verdad?
the
O sea,
state
todo esto
itself.
se puede superponer,
All of this can
superponer y
be
son derechos
superimposed,
diferentes.
and these are different
Eso es mi
rights.
tercer punto.
So this is
Ahora, el
my
cuarto
third
punto es, no hablan
remark. The
tampoco de los
fourth
campos de
remark, you
la
didn't speak
repartición del
about the
suelo,
changes in the
hablan
partition
solamente
of
de
the
la reforma
soil.
agraria. O sea,
Only
por haber
speak, you
vivido
only
una
speak about
experiencia de
agrarian
reforma agraria
reform.
cuando era
Since I
joven en
lived in
Nicaragua
an agrarian
y
reform
haber visto
experience in
después qué pasa
Nicaragua when I
cuando se
was young, I
termina
saw what
el
takes
momento
place when
político de la reforma
the
agraria. Creo
political
que estos
momentum and
cambios
of the
posteriores a
agrarian
la
reform
reforma
and the
agraria son muy
subsequent
importantes.
changes
Se
are
puede
also
ser
really
ligado con
important
los
and can
mecanismos
be
de
connected
herencias,
to
con los
the
mercados de derechos sobre la
mechanisms
tierra, y
of
eso también valdría la
heirs and
pena
land
tocarlo un poquito.
property.
Ahora,
And it's important to speak
para
about this
eso,
as
o sea,
well.
lo más
Now,
importante
to
al
this aim,
final
the
me
most
parece
important thing in the
ver
end of the
cómo se
day seems to
construyen
be to
mecanismos de
see how you
gobernanza
can
desde
build
abajo, ¿no? O sea,
government
cómo escojo
movements bottom up,
los
that
habitantes del
is,
campo, los campesinos,
those who live
los
in the
indígenas,
fields, the
toda la gente que
peasants, the
vive ahí en el
indigenous, and
terreno,
all those
cómo esto
living
construye
in the
mecanismos
ground,
que permitan
and build the appropriate
asegurar que
mechanisms to
van a
allow them to
mantener el
ensure
control de esta
that they will
tierra.
maintain the
Y
control over their
eso es
lands. And
casi
this
nunca
is
está abordado.
no,
Quizá
almost
eso eran
never
los cinco puntos
approached.
que
So I'm
quería
leaving these
tocar muy
five
rápidamente.
aspects, which I'd like to touch on
En el
really
sitio de
quickly.
Acter hay muchísimas cosas
In
que hemos
Agiter, we
trabajado
have many things
durante
that we
años
have
sobre estos
worked for
temas.
many
Hay
years
muchos
on these
elementos, no
topics.
todo está
There are
traducido al
many
castellano.
elements, not
Ciertamente
everything is
podemos
translated
traducir al
into Spanish,
castellano
and
la
I'll try
parte
to
que no
see
está,
if we can
que es muy
translate what
importante,
we still
pero
have to translate into
realmente
Spanish,
si
and which is
podemos
really important.
contribuir un
But
poco a
we
esta
can
discusión
contribute
y
indeed to
además
this
incluir
discussion,
elementos de la
as
experiencia de
well as
Colombia
include
en el sitio
elements
de
from the
Acta, te
Colombian
agradeceríamos. Muchas gracias.
experience to our Agiter site would be fabulous.
Gracias,
Thank you.
Michelle. Gracias.
Thank you, Michelle.
Discúlpame,
I am
Gabriel,
sorry,
Ruby y
Gabrielle,
perdón, las
Ruby,
personas también en el chat.
and I
Ahorita
apologize
vuelvo con
because our
ustedes.
friends in
Yo
the
creo
chat
que ya
box, I'll
tenemos más
return to
preguntas.
you. I
Entonces,
believe we have many
ustedes
questions
van a ser los
already.
primeros en
So you will
esta
be the
ronda y
first
después
in the
vamos a
next
nosotros.
round, okay? I hope we
No
can
sé
reach the
si
others too.
quiere ir Nuri desde
Nuri, would you like
Defenso Agro
to
primero
speak about
en el mismo
Defensor
orden, si
Agro
mejor,
first and in the
o
same
para
order?
facilitar las
I'll
cosas.
continue
Adelante,
using the
Nuri.
same order to facilitate
Vale,
things.
gracias. Bueno, gracias a
Thank
Michelle por
you,
lo que ha
Michelle,
planteado.
for
Creo
what
que
you
en los
have
términos que hemos
proposed. I
hablado
believe
nosotros
in the topics that we have
hemos
mentioned,
colocado
we
estos
have
elementos que él
added
ha dicho
these
con
elements that you
otras,
have
con otras
mentioned
palabras,
with
pero
other words. But it's
importante.
important to take
Yo
account of
quiero
what you
referirme
said.
al tema
I'd like
de
to
de lo de
mention
la
the
agroindustria,
topic
el tema de la
of
juventud. Bueno,
the youth
cuando
and
nosotros hablamos de la
industry.
agroindustria y implementarla,
When we
pues lo
speak
hacemos
about
para producir
agricultural
mucho más,
industry and we spoke about the production, which is a lot
intensa,
more related to
intensiva o extensiva
a lot more
intensa
intense or
del
extensive,
campesinado.
but intensive
Entonces,
by the
nosotros
peasantry.
decimos que somos pequeños
And we say
productores
that
y
we are
hablamos de la
smallholders
sostenibilidad
and we
y
speak about
significa que
agriculture and
no estamos de acuerdo con
sustainability.
los
This
monocultivos.
means that
Entonces
we
está la
are
producción
not in
de
agreement with
cacao, está la producción de
monoculture.
café, pero
And we
como
have the
parte
production of
de la
coca and
producción puede ser
coffee,
el
but
principal,
as part
pero
of
lo hacemos
our
nosotros
production.
y
And we
creemos
have
dentro de lo que
additional
se ha planteado
fields
la
and
reforma agraria
believe
integral.
in what the
La
comprehensive
infraestructura
agrarian
que
reform
llamamos,
has
bueno,
been
nosotros
proposed. We
trabajamos
have the infrastructure.
con la agroindustria
We're an agro industry.
que se ha planteado siempre para
And we
producir
have
combustible y bueno, todavía
proposed
como
to
una
which is smaller by nature, but enables the transformation of what we call the added value for commercialization. And this is part of what we propose for the agrarian reform purposes. And it has to do with access to land, to seeds, and everything that has to do with a comprehensive approach about roads, education, health. So everything that's related to ending this injustice that we see in the moment, which is related to the youth, right? And the issue of recognition of the peasantry is really important that we look at the initiatives of the peasantry and their organizations in Colombia, which are far-reaching. And we have a peasant community, for instance, but we don't want it to be recognized by the Ministry of Education as a formal institution, but we want to have the autonomy and the pedagogy that we use and the methodology that we use not to be in their terms, but to be based on the recognition of the peasants, which is the Administrative Act 01, because the youth must be trained professionally, but not for the large agribusinesses. So this means that they can be returning to the territories as lawyers, as engineers, as administrators. We need all professionals, doctors, and we want them to continue there. Therefore, the agrarian reform must have a generational focus, must prioritize the youth, the women. It's important to have these elements borne in mind for an agrarian reform. And effectively, we think about the consequence of the Green Revolution, which wanted to end it with the peasantry in the world. They wanted to exterminate, and fortunately, due to the resistance of the peasantry and our allies, such as the academia and intergovernmental entities and sustainability in the cities, we have resisted, and we're here, and we're showing that it's what's necessary to attain the society that we want as peasants. And the society nowadays has to bring to the center of the discussion the social function of the land, and agrarian reform is necessary in the world, not only to produce food, but also to conserve the planet and its biodiversity, that is, to protect humanity itself. It's a bit of what we are discussing, and I believe all these topics in this webinar are important for the conference that we will be holding quite shortly.
Muchas gracias, Nuri.
Many thanks, Nuri. Super remarks.
Nuri SSJ, por favor.
Nuri SSJ, please.
Hola, ¿me escuchan?
Can you hear me?
La escuchamos, sí.
Yes, we hear you.
Bueno,
Well,
contarles que
I'd like to tell you that a little bit about the figures that we have reviewed in terms of properties of livestock. Approximately 39 million hectares, a third of the country, are in the hands of the big livestock rearers of Colombia. And the website that Professor Jennifer mentioned regarding the control of how things are advancing in terms of the counter of the ministry, it reports to us that this Fedegan and private 206,000 hectares corresponding to more than 800 plots. So an idea of the 39 million hectares for livestock and the 206,000 that have been bought or that are related to the purchases from Fedegal. And let's say that the information that the National Land Agency has specifically regarding the Fedegan purchases until 2025, they reported over 35,000 hectares of the 30 million hectares. So these figures show, as we said, as one of the participants asked about the figures, it enables us to see how much is missing in terms of purchase of plots and land areas, but it's necessary to identify that the same national agency said that 48% of these plots, which were expected for purchase by the Colombian state, have been considered as unfeasible through technical or legal conditions. So it's not feasible for allocation to peasant families for different grounds, or because legally there are difficulties considering these lands, including the land grabbing of empty or vacant lands that were in the hands of people who were amassing different properties in different regions, and they have been benefiting from displacements. And also considering the implementation of agro-industrial process in those territories, which are not related to the use and customs and traditions of the peasantry populations. So we insist that it is important to have the recognition of the rights of the peasantry and to continue reviewing things on a case-by-case basis, and say that in our daily life, in our follow-up activities with peasant areas, we see that the topic of lands goes through the requests and how the information is collected of those requests, but how they also move and everything that the peasant community requires. It's a long process. Unfortunately, the agrarian processes, they should last between 1 and 3 years, but actually they last. We have processes that go for more than 30 years unresolved, and where not only the land authority takes a decision favorably to the peasants, but we have big courts and the constitutional courts that have protected the rights of people, and it orders the entity to take position and take a route to ensure those rights, and it's not attained. And say that with this landscape of the government and the Petro government proposing changing, is also facing many difficulties. And I believe that, as was mentioned before, it's important to remember that we need efforts at the global level to provide support to the Colombian society to maintain, so to speak, this idea of change and redistribution, and which is necessary in Colombia to continue with the requirability of the rights of rural populations, so that we will not see things being left aside, as was mentioned. But not only the economic dimension, as also the cultural and political dimension of the peasantry vis-a-vis the use of the land and the collectivity, and how the communities are able to get together and resist based on this collective aspect, based on this sharing of resources, of occupying the territories and maintaining certain natural resources to ensure the livelihoods of all future communities. There's a big difficulty in the fields in Colombia in terms of related to the youth, because we have seen that, and we have worked with the restitution of lands. There are some processes, some that have lasted more than 13 years, despite the issuance of a favorable decision for the peasants. The community, when they receive the news, they can't return to the territories because there are families where, unfortunately, people who fought for the land have already died, and the youth do not want to return to the country because they do not have assurances to continue. So let's say that the Colombian state has been working in the construction of an official instrument of public policies that enables to collect international loans, to work in to produce possibilities so that the peasants can return to the land, have count on follow-up and the productivity of the land, which is whether working with coffee, cocoa tourism, and how to have follow-up for their projects. So that's a bit of what's taking place on the national basis, what has been established as a source regarding $85 million with the aim of bringing to Colombia the elements in favor of what has been called I forgot the name, the concept, that's the title of this program. It's a rural aspects for life, basically. It's in this sense that we must consolidate these contributions for the conference as well. Thank you. Many thanks,
No sé,
Nuri.
Mathieu y las panelistas,
Mathieu,
si
I don't know, the
es que
panelists as
estamos
well. Since we
no
are
sé, Matthew,
reaching
si
the
se permite
time,
otros 4
Mathieu, would you
minutos
allow us for
para
additional 4 minutes
Jenny
so
cerrar.
that Jenny can close?
¿Se puede, Matthew?
Is it possible, Mathieu?
Actually, I would ask to the interpreters first. Thank you to them, actually, to Mariela and Dermeval. Would you accept to translate for a few minutes more to conclude? I think that we can.
Yes, Mathieu, we accept it.
They kindly accept. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Matthew. Yo le pido disculpas a Gabriel,
My
a Ruby
apologies,
y a todas las
Gabriel,
personas
Ruby, and
hicieron
everyone
preguntas en el
who
chat. Yo,
asked
la verdad,
questions on the
calculé
chat.
mal los
To
tiempos.
be
Yo pensé
honest,
que íbamos
I
a tener tiempo para
miscalculated
otra
the time. I
ronda.
thought we'd
Hice
have
mal
more
el
time for
cálculo
another round of
y les pido, la
questions. I
verdad, disculpas.
apologize.
Quisiera dar
I
entonces
would like
la
to
última
then
palabra a Jenny para
give
ir
Jenny
cerrando
the
este
floor
diálogo.
for
Y
some
de
closing
pronto la gente
remarks, and perhaps
va saliendo del evento. Quisiera
those of you who
Uy,
need
hay
to
un eco
leave,
terrible.
there is an echo, unfortunately.
Pueden apagar los
There,
micrófonos, por favor. Yo
if you
creo que
could
el
switch
eco va
off
por
your
ahí.
microphones, I would appreciate it. I believe we have an echo because
Nada,
of
no,
that.
quería como yo
I
creo que
would
la gente va a ir
like,
saliendo,
as
cerrando
you leave,
el evento,
to
entonces
perhaps
quería
some
como
of you
antes de que
must
Jenny
leave, but
tiene su última
before
intervención, como darles
that, I
gracias
would like
a
to
las panelistas, a las tres por
thank
sacar
the
tiempo de sus
panelists before
agendas tan
Jenny
apretadas por
can
acompañarnos
speak, for
y
giving us of
también
your
a Acter
time.
por
And I'm
pues,
sure you're all very
coordinar la
busy,
organización de este
and for
evento
Actor
y a
for
los
coordinating the
traductores y a
event,
todos,
and to
pues
the
realmente
interpreters,
hemos
everyone, thank you
comido
so
muchísimo
much.
más en 2 horas,
We've really covered a
pero
lot over the last
pues
2
yo de verdad
hours,
he
but
estado pensando mucho, aprendiendo mucho y
I've
les
been really
agradezco a
thinking
todos.
a
Bueno,
lot,
Jenny,
and
le doy la última palabra.
I appreciate it all
No,
very
yo les
much.
quiero
Jenny,
agradecer a
I would
todos. Me
like
gustó mucho la
to thank
intervención
everyone. I
de
really
Michael o
enjoyed
Michelle.
Michelle's
Creo
intervention.
que es muy
I think
importante
it's important
recuperar
to recover
este saber que ya
this
por décadas se ha
knowledge
venido
that over
demostrando
the last few
empíricamente,
decades have
y es que el
been
campesinado
showing
en el
that the
mundo es
peasants in the
mucho más
world
eficiente y
are a
mucho
lot
más
more
productivo que
efficient
la gran
and a
mayoría.
lot more
La pequeña
productive
y mediana productividad
than
son mucho más
big
eficientes y
companies.
productivas. Si el campesinado no hay vida,
If
sin el
without the
campesinado
peasants,
no hay
there's no
alimento en
life.
nuestra mesa,
Without
sin el
them, there's no food on
campesinado
the
no
table.
hay
Without
conservadores
peasants, there
de
is
la
no
naturaleza, de los
protection of
bosques.
nature, of
Y creo
forests.
que se trata de
And I
recuperar
think it's about
esta emocionalidad de la que nos
bringing
hablaba
back
Sofía
this
y de
emotion that Sophia
devolvernos
was
a
referring
la
to
raíz
and
y a
going
la
back
tierra.
to our roots and to the
La
land.
tierra es más que un
The
activo
land
rural.
is
No sé si
more
profesor
than a
Tumorras
rural
que la tierra
asset.
es la
Professor
madre,
Tumura
pero también
says
es el
that
espacio
the
social,
land
pero
is
también
mother,
es
but
el
it's
lugar de la
also a
producción, pero
social
también es el
space, but
lugar
it's
donde
also
hacer
the place of
vínculos sociales.
production and where
Es el
there is
lugar que nos
social
provee de las
bonds. It's the
medicinas, que
place
nos
that
provee
provides
lo que
us with
necesitamos para
medicine
la
and with what
reproducción
we
de la vida en
need
sociedad.
for the
Y quiero cerrar
reproduction
con
of
eso,
life as a society. And
que no
that's
hay
what I'd
vida
like to close with.
posible
There
si
is no
no
possible
cambiamos
life
nuestras
if we
formas de
don't
producir,
change the
nuestra
way in
forma
which
de
we
consumir,
produce, the
nuestra
way in which we
forma
consume,
de,
the way
de
in
abordar los
which
desechos que producimos,
we
nuestra forma
deal
de
with the
comercializar. Tenemos
waste,
que
we
cambiar
trade. We have to
nuestros modelos
change our
de desarrollo,
models,
porque si no, no es ni
development
posible y
models,
no hay
because
futuro
there is no
posible.
possible life otherwise,
Allí,
no
las comunidades
possible future.
afrodescendientes, como
Afro-descendant
decían las
communities, as
participantes,
one of the
los
participants was
pueblos indígenas
saying,
y
the
el
indigenous
campesinado,
peoples
yo sé que
and
son
the
la esperanza del
peasants, I
planeta, no
believe,
quiero
are the
sonar
hope of
romántico,
our planet. I don't want to be
pero lo son.
romantic, but they are.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you
Muchas
so
gracias,
much,
Jenny.
Jenny.
Muchas gracias a todos de nuevo.
Thank you
Discúlpame
all
las,
once
todas las
again.
preguntas sin
Once again, I
responder de
apologize
las
for all the
personas que
unanswered
quisieran hablar y no tuvieron
questions and those who
oportunidad.
wish to
Les
speak
pido
and need to have the
disculpas y pues
opportunity
de
to
nuevo
do
las
so. I
gracias a
apologize.
todos también
And
los
I thank you all
participantes que
once
vinieron
again,
a
all the
acompañarnos y
participants
escuchar.
who have been
Gracias.
joining us.
Bueno,
Thank you so
chao.
much. Bye bye.
Chao,
Chao.
muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Chao.
Chao, chao, chao.
Merci
Gracias, abrazos.
Chao, gracias.
beaucoup à toutes et à tous. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
A todos.